This is the world's first map of all theories of consciousness, and it now covers 325 competing theories.
What is the totality of human thinking and passion about consciousness?
After 3 decades and hundreds of interviews, the legendary Closer to Truth host Robert Lawrence Kuhn set himself a monumental task: to create the world's first map of all scientific theories of consciousness.
With consciousness, the more we've learned, the more theories we have.
Progress in science normally means to get to a single theory that explains a phenomenon. But when it comes to our most direct experience of reality, consciousness, there is an explosion of theories. As humanity, we are completely divided in understanding the most fundamental aspect of our existence.
Life after death, personal identity, purpose and value depend on your theory of consciousness. And if you don't think so, it doesn't matter, because it still is. You just have an assumed theory of consciousness. I mean, the materialists say they're not making a leap of faith, they're just going by science, but their leap of faith is that mental states can be described in terms of physical states. I'm not a relativist. In fact, I've quipped at some point is that it's not that we have too many theories, it's that we have one too few.
I had promised not to push Robert Lawrence Kuhn on his own view, but I couldn't resist it.
If you're forcing me to reveal it, and for what little it's worth, here's what I think.
Robert Lawrence Kuhn was in Paris for a Closer to Truth shoot.
That's beautiful.
Had his map of all theories of consciousness brought him closer to truth or to madness? I'm sitting here, nice Paris hotel room, and I'm studying Subway. The map of all consciousness theories Kuhn had spent more than a year working on made me think of the Paris subway system. Complex as it is, it does look tidy in schemes like these. But every traveler knows that the complexity gets messy once you really dive in. You can get lost in the theories of consciousness just as you can get lost in the Paris subway system. In this conversation, we will cover over 325 theories of consciousness. These will be our stops. You can also find them in the timestamps. As your tour guide on the journey into the landscape of consciousness, I do have to be open and transparent. I have a favorite position on the map. The Essentia Foundation is all about analytic idealism, and we point to the fallacy and inconsistencies of materialist theories of consciousness. That being said, we are also about hardcore science, and in trying to falsify my own views and reading about the materialist theories on the landscape, I was actually quite surprised, because some of them I read as basically being idealist. We live in interesting times. I think metaphysical boundaries are silently moving, and I think the map Kuhn has made will prove to be a historical document of the status quo of thinking about consciousness and metaphysics in 2025.
We arrived on location.
Yep.
Beautiful city.
I would be interviewing someone who had basically interviewed everyone himself in the field of consciousness studies. How do you prepare for an interview like that? Well, you just wait until the interviewee summarizes all his knowledge for you. You created this. This, for all of us watching, is a landscape of consciousness. In it, you try to collect and categorize all theories of consciousness. What made you do this? Because it's a daunting thing to do. And, of course, as an opening question, has it brought you closer to truth? But first, sort of what made you do this?
As a pre-teenager and an early teenager, I was consumed, as some of us are, with the nature of ultimate reality. And whether it's the existence of God or an afterlife, and what is life all about? And I determined that the way to discern it would be to study either physics or philosophy. And I began thinking about it and which college I would go to and how I would do that. And then One day, I can still remember it, that I had the sudden realization that the only way we can perceive physics or construct philosophy is via our brains. I began to be interested in broader aspects of it, like parapsychology, and is that real? And if it's real, does it violate the laws of physics? And what would that imply about the nature of reality? And so at that point, consciousness became something that was the focus of my interest. The core idea of consciousness is that I feel very strongly that whatever ultimate reality really is, that consciousness plays a role in its determination. Now, that is not to say that I'm saying that consciousness is fundamental reality. That's not to say that. It is to say that that consciousness is a determinant of what that is, because if consciousness is indeed material, and we can define what that means in a very grand sense, and there are 100 or more materialistic theories that I've cataloged in originally 10 subcategories, and now it'll be 12 subcategories when it expands. But because if consciousness is material, then that is a determinant of ultimate reality. If it's not, then there's a broader set of possibilities of what consciousness. That's why consciousness, to me, is the test. Yeah. And perhaps it's the only test in terms of thinking rigorously and analytically. Consciousness is the key to ultimate reality, one way or the other. And if that's the case, what I want to do is to compile the best human thinking throughout history, but mainly today, on this topic. And what is the totality? What is the scope of human thinking and passion about consciousness? So we have that link between consciousness being the key to ultimate reality, and then we get the entirety of human thinking about consciousness. And that, to me, is electrifying.
How do you define consciousness? Can you sort of grasp it sort of like in a couple of sentences?
I've approached consciousness, fairly simply. People have done it very sophisticated. Ned Block talks about access consciousness, but I use the term of art is phenomenal consciousness, which is the felt inner experience, the smell of garlic cooking in olive oil, the sight of your newborn daughter just emerged from a cesarean section, the fifth movement of Mahler's Second Symphony with the choral. I mean, those experiences, and even the ordinary experiences that we have, the inner movie, all different ways to express it. That's the focus, phenomenal consciousness. It's not the content of consciousness per se, because it have all these different kinds, olive oil, child, music, those are all radically different. But it's that felt inner experience.
Yeah, which we kind of get around,
And that's it.
Yeah,
and that's it. And I try to exclude everything else, because a lot of other related things, like perception, like content of consciousness, and there are a lot of theories about that. People have free will as part of it, but I try to tease apart and dissect out everything but theories of phenomenal consciousness.
Great. In diving in the landscape, which I want to do right now, first of all, good to just share with the audience. We'll put this oversight with it, which I think is great, sort of on screen for you guys to watch. So we have sort of the main categories: materialism, non-reductive physicalism, the quantum theories of consciousness, then integrated information theory, panpsychisms, monisms, dualisms, idealisms, what Essentia Foundation is about, analytic idealism, and then anomalous and altered states. And you have a final category of challenge theories. Now, Robert, please correct me if I'm wrong. I was talking historically, the route, if we would take an historical route, I'd say that, the oldest are the Vedic literature, the Indian theories. So that sort of main human thinking around consciousness starts out with sort of idealist notions. But correct me now if I'm wrong, right? I'm going to sketch how I think what the history, how it went, just my understanding. So we started out with idealist notions of consciousness, that consciousness is the ultimate reality. Then out of that, you see in Abrahamic religions sort of notions of dualism, that yes, there might be sort of consciousness, but there's also a sort of world created that has a sort of ontological base. So there's matters of dualisms, and monisms sort of maybe also, but that's more or less it. And then out of that dualism comes the idea, but wait a minute, what if that sort of matter is the fundamental stuff? And if can't we draw just consciousness out of matter? And then we see this big explosioning happen in Western thinking. And now, funny enough, to just share with me my analysis when reading your landscape, I see this interesting return again in the 20th century, that now out of materialism with its problems, which we will also hopefully touch upon, the hard problem of consciousness, we now end up with people going back to dualisms again. And of course, idealism. I'm
panpsychisms.
Yeah, Bernardo Casper is the director of our foundation. We have something like Analytic Idealism. So I just see this very interesting circular move in history. But just curious, as sort of a grand overview for our audience, and in reading your landscape, that I wanted to share with you, and curious what you think.
Sure, that's great, and I would generally subscribe to what you say. I would put some nuance on it. Certainly, historically, the first expression that consciousness is fundamental come from the Vedic scriptures, and was expressed in a plethora of schools of Indian philosophy, which are all fascinating. Advaita Vedanta today is a non-dualism school. That's the dominant one, but there were dualism schools in ancient India as well. I mean, as many different Christian sects we see today, that was duplicated among. I mean, that's just a human sociological tendency of different views, different expounders of philosophy. So that was one tradition. I wouldn't say the Abrahamic traditions came out of that. I would not have a cause effect there. I would say that is a different tradition that began with a different ontological foundation, which is a theistic one that the Abrahamic religions had, and beginning with Judaism and then Christianity and Islam. We can talk about each one of those in great depth as their approach. So I would say that was a quasi-independent development, and both then continued. Then a materialistic view began, of course, with the Renaissance of scientific revolution, and where science became a way of doing, natural philosophy. It was originally, sort of philosophical theology, and then it became natural philosophy, and then it became science. It was an approach to use a scientific method of providing third-party verification, because everything else we're talking about is either first-person awareness or it is group tradition. But the scientific approach was something that would have independent third-party recognition. So everybody would have to agree with Newton's, laws. Obviously, they were, then superseded by Einstein's relativity. But then everybody generally will agree with that. And the same thing has approached through the development of chemistry and physics, molecular biology, etc. And so materialism grew out of that theory. So you have, if you want to take three different traditions, and there are more, but you have the idealism coming out from India, you have a dualistic approach coming out of the Abrahamic religions, and then you have materialism coming out of the scientific revolution and the scientific traditions. And now we're all merging together, and we see what's happening, and that's what I love doing. So before we get into a detailed discussion of the landscape, I would like to, if I can, give you my big overview of how this came about and why I did it, because it is important. I mean, the individual theories as I've said, I put my life and heart and soul into each one, pretending for 1 or 2 nights that was my theory, and I want the world to understand my theory, and I was going to do my best to explain it in 800 words or whatever. But there's a bigger overview here. And I started, as we've said, that consciousness is, in my opinion, it's not absolutely sure, but in my opinion, is the key to ultimate reality. One way or the other. It's not just that consciousness is ultimate reality. I'm not saying that. I am saying that it's the key to know what ultimate reality is. And then I start and look at the world, and I see the great human contributions, the great enormous human thinking, historically, contemporarily, into consciousness. So I have 2 overarching objectives for studying consciousness the way I have. Number 1 is my view, and you may disagree, and others may disagree, is that now is a time to appreciate the diversity and the creativity and the innovation of how human beings think about consciousness. And so I am of a mind to let 100 flowers bloom, to see them all, and to discern out of those we think make a contribution. And you have to make a choice. There's a lot of, I would say, not so rational ideas about consciousness, and there's lots of fringe thinking, and who's to judge what's fringe and what's the mainstream, and these are all obviously epistemologically uncertain. Everybody makes their own judgment. I make my own judgments. People can say I'm wrong. And that's fine. I like that. But make a judgment about which of these. But to really see this landscape and to appreciate the great contributions of human beings from all these different perspectives. So that's objective number 1. Objective number 2, and this has come up more recently, particularly in light of questions of AI consciousness, but it's broader than that, is that the big questions of human sentience and human existence are completely dependent upon your theory of consciousness. Let me explain what that means. What are these big questions? Big questions are, is there meaning or purpose in life? What is value? What is personal identity? How do you maintain personal identity? Is there free will? There's great controversy about free will. What things are conscious? Is an amoeba conscious? Is a lobster conscious? A dolphin? As well as humans. And then you get into AI consciousness, and that's a hot topic in society for various ethical and existential reasons that people are concerned about that. And then from that, virtual immortality. Is it possible to upload our first-person consciousness to non-biological materials and live, if not forever, for an indeterminate amount of time until the heat death of the universe or something. And then finally, life after death. So that panoply of big ideas that we deal with, and each of the topics that I just mentioned are vast areas in themselves. They're vast landscapes and various opinions. But I want to cut through all of that. And I want to say that each of those questions and how you answer them are dependent on what your theory of consciousness is. And if you don't think so, it doesn't matter. Because it still is. You just have an assumed theory of consciousness. What I'm not sure is how each of the theories would express itself in these big questions. And that requires some thought. I started the process in landscape, but that doesn't mean I had it right or I will change my mind. But I think this is a wonderful thing to explore, where diverse people look at these big questions and then explore each of the kinds of theories of landscape, of consciousness, that would have implications for these theories. Now I want to zero in on the landscape itself and say, what are my overarching thinking about the landscape itself? Now, I said why it's important. Now, what about it itself? And so, again, I have two big categories. The first category is that normal science, the more you learn, the more confident you are about certain theories. And so, when there was the microwave background radiation discovered in 1965 or so, and the results of that greatly supported the Big Bang theory, and if not falsified, at least undermined the steady state theory. So as science learns more in general, we've seen this in particle physics, molecular biology, there are fewer and fewer theories, and they get more narrow. You can never really prove a theory right. Arguably, you can falsify and prove some theories wrong, but that's the process. With consciousness, the more we've learned, especially in the last, half century or so, since I did my doctorate degree, I was working on brain stuff, and everybody's, brain science has been an enormous increase. The more we've learned, the more theories we have. And so that, to me, is telling that as science has advanced, this is the only subject that I know of, consciousness, in which the more we learn, the more theories we have, not the fewer. So that, to me, is a neon sign flashing.
Yeah.
There's something going on here. This proliferation of theories. That's what we're talking about. The second point that you notice is what I call the locus of the key point of consciousness. Obviously, we're in a world, we are a human being, I have a brain, at different orders of magnitude. Where is the point that the consciousness is happening? And each theory has a place in which that happens. And to me, the second big idea, in addition to the proliferation of theories, is the vast dispersion of order of magnitude of where the theories are taking place. We can start at the smallest level, which is quantum. And there are some theories that would have the quantum nature of subatomic particles. And then you go to quantum expressions within cells. Penrose Hameroff and the microtubules, and others have it in different parts of the cell. And then, of course, you can go beyond that to panpsychisms or idealism, where consciousness is, in a sense, everything, the entirety of the universe, whether it's a cosmopsychisms or a cosmic consciousness or idealism in some sense. So you have this enormous range. You can't have a larger range from the smallest quantum, and you go each of the steps. And there are theories at each of these steps. So those are the two big overviews, the proliferation of theories and the vast range at which the consciousness, the critical event occurs at that point. And from that framework, we can talk about specifics. The first question I have when I just look at, again, this was not done a priori, but it was done a posteriori. When I had this whole thing and looked at it, I noticed that of the number of specific theories at the lowest level, which was order of magnitude, let's just say 200, roughly half were materialism theories. When materialism is only one of sort of 8 categories. I have 2 categories at the end, which are not theories in themselves. One is what I call anomalous and altered state theories, which are theories that are motivated by anomalous, parapsychology, ESP, near-death experiences, out-of-body experience, all those kinds of things, as well as meditative states, psychedelic states, and all of that. Those are different ways. Those are not theories of consciousness, but they are ways that people who are into that use to develop their theories. So I made it a separate category. And then challenge theories are people who have either challenged the whole exercise as being beyond our capacity to understand, or different ways of framing it. So leaving those 2 aside, there are 8 sort of substantive theories of consciousness categories. And again, materialism is one, and it has almost 50% of all the total. So why is that the case? That was my question. And I began to think, and then became obvious that if you have the first nodal point that you decide is the physical world able to describe consciousness without remainder? Nothing else. Almost everyone agrees that the physical world and the physical brain is necessary for our kind of consciousness, but some people would say it's not sufficient. And if it's not sufficient, that means there must be some kind of a non-physical reality of some kind. It can be, from property dualism on the one hand, where it supervenes on the physical, to idealism on the other extreme. I mean, and all of that, but all of that brings something non-physical into the metaphysics of reality. And so that's the critical point. Does it have something other than the physical as defined? In physical, you can expand the physical beyond the physics we know today, but still we know what we mean by physics and quantum physics or dimensions or something. And so once you do that, now if you go to the non-physical, there's something non-physical about it. Because it's an ipso facto condition, because you're saying there's something non-physical about it, because that's your division point. So in these categories, there's something non-physical. You're not saying it's all non-physical, but you're saying something about it. Once you do that, you are then walking outside the arena in which the scientific method can be wholly valid. And so the amount of progress that you can make in each theory beyond that is somewhat limited in terms of our collective agreement on a theory. You may have a vision and therefore believe that that's real, but that doesn't convince me. So it's non-third party determinant. It can be first person determined, but non-third party. It's not a consensus view. Once you are outside once you introduce anything non-physical, you then, to one degree or another, eliminate the possibility of a scientific method. If you don't have anything non-physical, if you say it's all physical, then you can arguably make progress, because you can apply scientific methodology to discerning it, and therefore you get a proliferation of different ideas, because you're able, or at least think you're able, if you have that materialist constraint, you then can make progress. It doesn't mean you're progressing in the right direction or coming to a right answer, but you can move along a trail of doing scientific work, whereas in the non-physical area, you're not. That's why there are more bottom line theories under a materialist view than there are under, any of the non-materialist views, and roughly the equivalent. That's the reason. That has nothing to do with the veridical veracity of the theory. It's nothing to do with it. It's just almost a sociological, or it's an epistemological analysis of why there are so many materialistic theories. And that's kind of a meta way of thinking about why so many materialistic theories.
I think this is very interesting. It's a very, very clarifying insight to hear this from you, because it's this sort of methodological commitment to science and doing science that you want to remain as long as possible within this framework, and you want to stretch sort of your metaphysics as long as possible. But I must say that in that stretching of the metaphysics within that category, you hear stuff that makes me think you are now sort of almost leaving the category of materialism, and in sort of our most accurate, this is a bit of a jump, right, to quantum, but I do think it can help us here. It's in a sense our most accurate theory of reality, and in the foundations of physics, of course, physicality in the sense of observer-independent physical properties is sort of now highly disputed, right? So hasn't our sort of methodology of science in quantum theory now brought us to this metaphysics staring us in the eye? That's at least what fascinates me. Also interviewing people, lots of people in the foundations of physics.
Yes.
And it's a bit of a jump towards, we should, of course.
That's why I put quantum in a separate category under materialism, because in one sense it's still a physical theory, but it adds something beyond the physical, or at least there's disputations along the line.
On which it doesn't really make a claim yet, but yeah.
But let's stick with the materialism, because you ask a good question, that some of the theories in materialism have this claim. Now, that seems to go beyond materialism. And I would put them in the category of enactivism and phenomenology. And these are harder to understand because your reaction is a normal reaction. In fact, my reaction is the same. But I'd make this point clear that all of the main protagonists of an activism or embodied, well, an activism, let's stick with that, and phenomenology, they say they are materialists. They say it. So if you think they're not, or I think they're not, they think they are.
Okay, that's interesting. And you wanted to honor that, and that I think I appreciate that.
They say they are. In fact, they go out of their way to say they are. Now, you may think that's hard to explain. In fact, when they say they are, they don't spend a lot of time explaining why they are still that way. But they say it's within. And as I got into it, and I did not appreciate phenomenology before I did the paper as much as I should have. And I appreciate it more now, and it's something I want to appreciate more so. And it deals somewhat with the distinction between continental philosophy and Anglo-American analytic philosophy. And it attempts to take the whole person as a gestalt, as a unified aspect, and not break it into parts, and that you understand this whole person aspect of personhood, and in order to understand now, a subfield of that, which some very smart people have supported, is called neurophenomenology. It was started by Francisco Villela a long time ago, I think the late 1990s, and language for a while now is taken up by a number of people. You mentioned Evan Thompson and his collaborators in his book, The Blind Spot, Michelle Bitball, and others have taken up neurophenomenology as a way to give primacy to the experiential, and yet develop that in a neurological context, but not emphasizing the neurology, but to keep both at the same ontological level. That's their desire, to keep the neuroscience and the phenomenology of the experiential whole person at the same level. Now, that's not the case in neurobiological theories at all. You don't need the person at all. You're just dealing with these recurrent circuits or electrical, electromagnetic fields or whatever your individual theory is. And so neurophenomenology tries to keep them both at the same level. But it is a kind of a promise that can make progress. There's been little demonstration that progress can be made in that idea, but I respect that idea a lot because I think it does reflect on the nature of consciousness, and it also the neurophenomenological mandate that they would like to pursue does undermine to some degree the rest of materialism. Because it says that the neurobiological approach or the electromagnetic field approach is not going to be sufficient. Now, again, they're not claiming to be non-physicalists in any way whatsoever. They think it is all physical, but it has to be something that's that puts both the neuroscience and the phenomenology at the same level of ontological existence. And that's a challenge, and that's something that that the burden is on them to show that it works. But what they do, which is your observation, which I agree with, is they do undermine some of the materialistic thinking.
I do think it's a very interesting point where phenomenology enters sort of the materialist category, because it's the point where you say, instead of sort of taking observer independent a physical universe as our departure point, you now take a step back, say, wait a minute, you acknowledge the fact that world presents itself to the individual within something we call consciousness, and that's sort of the phenomenological approach. But that's also where, indeed, as you say, philosophically, problems arise, because if you don't want to keep both categories give them the same status, I mean, any sort of schooled philosopher will sort of tick you on the finger, say, wait a minute, you cannot just do that, right? Is that a way to look at it?
Phenomenology takes the individual as a whole and looks upon the individual as a whole and the lived experience of an individual. Experience is a very important factor in phenomenology. So it's the individual as a whole and the endurance of lived experience. And this they apply, broadly. Even in physics, they use these ideas as well in terms of process philosophy. All sorts of things are part of this kind of different way of thinking. But still, they do it within a physicalist, broadly construed way of thinking. And that when the individual as a whole is a lived experience, and then the world is presented to itself, then they use that as a way to discern what consciousness is. They don't start with consciousness. They start with, they're not looking to explain consciousness. They're looking to express this wholeness of human experience and human endeavor. And then that becomes a way of understanding, if you want to look at that, an approach to what consciousness is. Now, as neurosciences come in, they recognize phenomenology because phenomenology antedated real neuroscience. It goes back 100 years or whatever with different people, Husserl and different philosophers. But as neuroscience became a real science in the 20th century, they recognized they have to deal with that. And so the neurophenomenology became a way to try to create equal ontological status. And, you rightly may criticize that as not being ultimately workable. But their innovation, if you will, is to say they are. And the mistake that materialists make and the mistake that idealists make or dualists is that they're not doing that they're giving precedence, ontological precedence to one or the other. So the materialists are giving precedence to the neuroscience, and the dualists and idealists are giving precedence to the phenomenal experience or the consciousness, but neither are correct, because the only way to be correct is their theory, not my theory, their theory, is to have them at an equal ontological status as your presupposition to move forward. Now, how they move forward and what they do is a real question, because I haven't seen forward progress from that assumption.
Yeah.
I've not seen that, but open-minded. I mean, it is a different approach, and what I do like is that it is a different reflection on the old tension between the dualist idealist and the materialist point of view. The phenomenology approach is a different perspective on it.
Yeah, check. And what I take from it, as I just said, this interesting point that people can make this claim, but philosophically speaking, strictly philosophically, if an analytic philosopher studies sort of these different subcategories, he might sort of suspect, he might have come to a different arrangement within the landscape of consciousness, but your aim was to follow what people themselves say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I try to, as much as possible, take myself out of every equation to put myself in the shoes of each individual or group of individuals who have the theory and express it in the best possible way. And again, for a few hours or a day or two, pretend that that's my theory, and I'm trying to get the whole world to agree with it, and do it as rigorously as possible without injecting any other thoughts of thinking. And if somebody tells me that they're a materialist, I'm not going to say, well, you're not. I mean, I might
say so.
I might put that in parentheses and say, I'm having difficulty following this. I do that on occasion, but if they say they are, they are. Galen Strawson famously says that he's the real materialist because he is the one who puts consciousness as part of fundamental reality. And if you don't do that, you're not a real materialist. So,
that one was mind-boggling. I wrote it down. I will get to that quote, which was like, okay, now I'm lost.
Galen has a few
if
like that.
Stuff like this counts as materialism, now I'm properly lost. But in wrapping up sort of the category of materialism, I think it's safe to say for people to just understand that more or less all these theories say what Christoph Koch calls, what I really like, sort of no brain, never mind. We need the physical substrate that, whether we understand it or not, gives in the end rise to sort of consciousness.
Yeah, I would say that that's correct, and but I would also want to stress, even though I myself might not be a materialist ultimately, the richness and understanding of the different kinds of thinking that materialism that has emerged from materialism, and it's very rich. Even what some people ridicule in terms of eliminative materialism or illusionism, there is some deep thinking behind that. It's not to be, it's easy to ridicule that, but there is helpful and very interesting thinking behind that. So each of the subcategories under materialism brings some richness. Is that even illusionism, neurobiological thinking in terms of how the circuitry works, electromagnetic ideas, computational ways of thinking, and activism in terms of the embodiment and activism with the environment, theories that are, although all are evolutionary based, some are very strongly evolutionary based. And then the distinction between different levels of representationalism. First order, where the sensory input is happening and consciousness emerges immediately, or do you need a higher order representationalism, where you have to, that first order then has to be reflected, like a second derivative or something, that you have to go through the process again. And this is a lot of very rich science has been developed in each of these categories. So, we leave materialism, but recognize that all of these make some sort of a contribution to what we're talking about, and to oversimplify and sort of throw them all out is, in my mind, a mistake. Even though I wouldn't classify myself as a materialist, I do appreciate each of those contributions.
Yeah, I get that. And we interviewed, for instance, also Michael Levin, who also with his same technological approach to mind everywhere fits. But I know from my own conversations with Michael Levin that has to do with the fact that he just, I wouldn't say he wants to stay away, but he doesn't see the necessity to make any metaphysical claims. But to us, from a Essentia Foundation's perspective, it's just super interesting to see what he's working on, because, he does say stuff that there might be this Platonic realm that give rise to form, right? Where sort of these bioelectric fields that sort of are involved with morphogenesis play a role. Super interesting stuff. So that also is sort of just to say that within your landscape, I really think people should read sort of these different materialist theories and see for themselves. There's super
Levin's
interesting,
a great example.
Interesting stuff there.
Is in materialism. Exactly. And that's why each of these, to some degree or another, has a contribution to make in terms of understanding. That's a good example.
Okay, we spent quite some time here, but this was, of course, the biggest category. A couple of times you've now said that you not per se are materialists, you just wanted to openly study people that who call themselves a materialist. But how has sort of studying all of these different theories influenced your own thinking about materialism, because it's so wide?
Yeah. Originally, as I began to think about reality and consciousness, I had this thought when I was very, very young, and it hasn't left me. Maybe that means I've made no progress, but it hasn't left me. And it's this thought, and that is, should a being, an existing thing, we're a being, should a being that can conceive of eternity be denied it? Should a being that can conceive of eternity be denied it? And so that was an initial thought that I had that opened me to broader areas than pure science as a very young person. And that has stuck with me no matter what I've done, and has motivated my thinking. Now, maybe there's a kind of an imprinting irrationality to that, or an exaggeration of what it means, but it really still holds meaning for me. That should a being who can conceive of eternity ultimately be denied it? And to me, that sounds illogical in a strange way. And therefore, that opens me up to lots of non-materialistic kinds of thinking. And so as I've gone through the landscape and as I've developed theories, I have had a personal predilection towards non-physical theories myself, although I keep that very tightly under mental wraps when I do every theory. So literally, when every theory I write it as well as I can for each one. And so I would say, and I'd still say, that I am not a materialist in that way. But I had a personal experience in life in the last few years that has slightly shaken my non-materialist view. Slightly, very slightly. To be silly with percentages, if I was 98% sure that materialism was wrong, I'm now 92% sure that it's wrong.
Okay, tell us about that 6% change.
Yeah, so still 92%, but there was a slight change, and that was this. My daughter got married late in life, and her husband is younger, and they live in France, which is why we're here in Paris visiting them. And when they got married, my daughter was older. She was in her mid-40s, and they wanted to have a baby. And she had at least one miscarriage, which was genetically deformed, etc. So they didn't have children. But she had frozen her eggs when she was 35 or 33, so 10, 12 years before. And they had a few, and they studied them, and none of them were great, but none of them were fully acceptable. But there was one mosaic, they called it. A mosaic is an egg that could be good or could be bad. They don't know. So the only one, they took the chance. They defrosted it. Her husband flew to New York to fertilize it. It then was allowed to grow into a blastula with 100 cells, so they could test it to be sure that it seemed okay, because my daughter wanted to carry the baby, not have a surrogate. So her body had to be prepared for a year with hormones. Her parents, my wife and I, were not happy about that, because who knows what that could have, but she wanted to carry the baby. And so her body was prepared for a year, and then the blastula, the fertilized egg, was frozen for another year. After the egg was frozen for 10, 12 years, the blastula was frozen for a year, unfrozen. It was actually flown from New York to Los Angeles, unfrozen, implanted. And we went through innumerable genetic tests, as you would do. And the end of the story is our 5-year-old grandson Louis is what I would call, kind of seriously, the exact opposite of autism. He is the most socially engaged, eye-to-eye, joke-making kid who goes up to other people's tables and starts engaging them in conversations. And that whole process, as much as I have studied biology with a doctorate in science, has affected me, because there is so much richness in the purely physical world that it slightly shook my sense of the nature of consciousness. I have to admit it. And so my certainty that consciousness is non-material has dropped from 98% to 92%.
The granddad effect.
Yeah.
Wow, what a wonderful story.
Yeah. So
first of all, congratulations to you, your daughter, and your grand. It's amazing.
Yeah, and son-in-law. Yeah.
And son-in-law, of course. It's amazing. It points to sort of the miracle between brackets of science, that we are now able to do this. The only thing
it's baked into the original physicality. It's not just the technology. It's what's the potential is in the physical world.
My biggest question with non-reductive physicalism is that it needs, or it relies on emergence, right? Because you say we cannot reduce sort of all properties to their physical base. and therefore there's something we call emergence, and then you have weak and strong emergence. And I think here you need something like a strong emergence, right? You need a mind from matter, and you don't know it, so you say it emerges. And it has always felt for me, but this is really, I know it must be that I'm not very deep into these theories, as a sort of trick you play or something. What's sort of the current state of thinking around strong emergence? What are the most strong arguments in favor of it?
Well, first of all, differentiate weak and strong emergence. Weak emergence is when something, properties at one level are unknowable by properties at a lower level, but unknowable in the sense that you don't know it, like the properties of hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. You can examine those properties, but if I would tell you take two of the hydrogen and one of the oxygen, you put them together and you get a zillion of the molecules, you'll have something called wet. It'll be water and it'll be wet. And you never imagine how that could happen from studying oxygen gas and hydrogen gas. However, as science has advanced, you can explain it. And it has to do with the bonding angles of the hydrogen and oxygen and how they would slip past each other when you have enormous numbers of them. So that's explained. So that is weak emergence, where it is possible to explain in principle. And in fact, in that case, we have explained it. Strong emergence means it's impossible to predict the properties at a higher level from a lower level in principle. It's forever impossible, no matter how advanced your science. And the argument is that consciousness is perhaps the single member of that set. And that's the argument, that consciousness is the one thing in which there is strong emergence. And it's also allied with the concept of top-down causation, even though you have the whole physical world is just the combination of physical particles and fields at the lowest level, and the top is just a combination of them, yet the top then somehow has a causative power to affect what's down below. And so these are challenges. Non-reductive physicalism, and I'd put in the same category property dualism, where you have a single physical thing. The physical world is only real, but it has an irreducible property of dualism, a mental property. They're not exactly the same at all, but they have similar kinds of characteristics. I have always felt there was an incoherence in those views. Having done the consciousness paper, Landscape, I now appreciate those views more than I did. Yeah. But I'm still not a proponent of them. Non-reductive physicalism is interestingly used by some Christian philosophers of very high standing. Peter van Inwagen is best example, who is a believer and a philosopher of religion, but he's also a physicalist of the nature of the person. And so the problem that they have has to do within their religious system of the resurrection. What are you resurrecting? Is it the molecules of the body, and what happens to the same or different molecules? It's a very complicated analysis, because if you can, if you can create one, then you can create multiple, and where is so it gets a very involved process. But if you're a physicalist and you are a believer in the Abrahamic religion, in particular Christianity in this case, you have to reconcile that with a resurrection, and non-reductive physicalism is part of that process. So maybe the motivation, is not purely linear; it's sort of circular. You're making an ontological assumption about the nature of the world, existence of God, and afterlife, whatever, and then you have to explain what happens. And non-reductive physicalism is a way to do that. And as long as your motivation is clear, I'm fine with that, because it's an insight that's interesting. So as I said, property dualism and non-reductive physicalism, supervenience to a similar degree, where the physical is mental is supervened on the physical, but it doesn't have to be reduced to it, are interesting insights. But as I said, I've always felt slightly uneasy with all of them.
I agree with you, but I do think it's interesting, and it's good to mention also that there are very, very only top level. I mean, George Ellis, for instance, here that's like you appeared also on conferences, so there are some very.
I respect highly George Ellis, broadly Nancy Murphy, a philosopher of religion, as well as Peter Van Inweg and others.
Yeah. So moving on to quantum. Which has sort of this broad diversity because it relies so heavily on your whole interpretation of quantum mechanics, how you approach consciousness. I do think, and I was very curious what your thoughts are, also a bit beyond the paper, I'd say, just your conversations with physicists. What I notice, but it could be a bias here, is that in the foundations of physics, what is called these epistemic approaches that say, okay, we need to take a step back in understanding quantum mechanics and take the observer-centric approach to say maybe the theory is just about our knowledge of nature and it's not about what nature truly is, which means that the mathematics, the superposition, the quantum state might not be this particle wave duality or a particle being at different that very popular idea, right? On which sort of popular science series are based on the multiverse, etc. These physicists now say, no, wait a minute, maybe take a step back, and it's just about our knowledge. We cannot say that, and we have to take this observer-centric approach. Is becoming more and more prominent within physics, and it goes a bit against, I'd say, the more objective approach of someone like Roger Penrose, of course, who has his objective collapse and still wants to stay sort of, I wouldn't say physical, but how do you assess this sort of tension within the foundations of physics? And do you also, what I just sketched, do you see that sort of happening as well? Or is it sort of my bias in researching all of this?
Yeah, it's a complex question, and the pieces need to be teased apart. First of all, a question is, what is an observer?
That's a big one. Yeah.
So that's one. And I'd say a majority of people would say an observer, it doesn't have to be a conscious element. It can be just a measurement. And so a machine doing an observant, or even molecules colliding with each other, is a measurement in the broadest sense of the term. So, collisions between particles are their own observers, and so it's completely natural, and there's nothing spooky or mystical about it. I mean, so that's a common perception. The multi-world theory, which sort of takes the Schrödinger equation literally, and then has every expression in the branching off, has the virtue of not having to interpret the Schrödinger equation, not having to have a collapse. But to me, the cost is pretty high in terms of the nature of reality. Of course, who am I to say what reality is? It doesn't have to satisfy my interests of parsimony or being able to understand it. I fully submit to that. But still, it invites what David Lewis says is the incredulous stare when he had his plurality of worlds. There's just some things that you just feel just are crazy. And the multi-world interpretation, would be that for me, although some very good, very top physicists and very good friends are espouse that and really don't care what I think. But I just want to make the point that of the quantum theories, and I have about 20, and I'll have more in the future, that they're very diverse in terms of how people use quantum. We just say the word quantum. I was always a pretty high skeptic of anything quantum being relative. Maybe I was a neuroscientist by background, so I had that predilection, but I'm very skeptical of that quantum has any influence whatsoever on the consciousness process. In the early days, and in discussing with Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, both of whom were good friends, I was pretty tough on them in terms of their theories. I've become softer as they've persisted and have some interesting data. But I point out that theory is just one of a large number of different theories of how quantum could be involved in consciousness, and they differ radically from each other. Very, very important. You have, collapse of wave function. Henry Stapp, Dave Chalmers, and McQueen have talked about collapse of wave function. Stephen Wolfram talks about the rules of the Rulliad, which is his universe of rules in which quantum theory is derived from it. Federico Faggin on quantum information theory. I mean, there's just a huge number. John Torday, who's a physiologist, has symbiogenesis in the individual cells, which are quantum related. The development of quantum biology as a real science in terms of photosynthesis, bird migration, are two that are real and scientific, nothing to do with consciousness, but our biology, shows that quantum mechanisms are critical, not just in the sense that quantum is everywhere and on anything, because it's the fundamental reality, but actually quantum mechanisms are critical for these biological functions. So that's really significant. That gives a boost to quantum theories in general. And so I would divide quantum theories of consciousness into three broad categories. One is where quantum processes are operating in the brain. The Penrose-Hameroff microtubules is one. Roman Poznanski has it within the neurophil, the interstitial spaces in between neurons in the brain. So there are a lot of different places where it can occur in the brain. Second category are quantum theories that go beyond the brain. It's just the sort of the observer effect, and that consciousness is part of the universe, and it's expressed through the quantum world. And so the brain is sort of a mechanism that system uses, but it's not the quantum a process in the brain that's the consciousness. The consciousness is sort of outside, and it's using the brain, but it's quantum process in some sort of a consciousness quantum process, and then using the brain. It's a very different way of thinking. One is purely a mechanistic view of quantum, and the other has this generalized view, which would be more compatible with idealism, but brings quantum and idealism into effect. And then a third category might be how quantum processes are part of a dual aspect monism. That's part of that kind of is an emergent from some fundamental activity. So important when we understand quantum is that it's a vast universe of its own kind, and there are very, very different expressions within it. I should point out that there are, mainstream first-rate physicists who say that the whole effort of quantum consciousness is, I won't use a vulgar term, but I would say, Murray Gell-Mann put it as quantum flapdoodle. Carlo Rovelli today, who has a relational theory in physics, would dismiss any type of quantum of any kind that is relevant for, and it's just a kind of taking a modern popular view of quantum as with the observer and trying to make the observer more than it is, and where an observer can just be a measurement that the physical world can make with each other. So we want under quantum, which I take seriously, and more seriously than I did, for decades. Doing this paper and researching it, I now take it more seriously than I did. So I want to make that point. But still, I want to say that there's a great diversity on how it's expressed, and that it is largely rejected by, I'd say, most mainstream physicists.
Getting back to what we mentioned earlier in this conversation, relating it back to what people really get, understand, and what's relevant to them, conscious AI. I mean, we just concluded that you, within computational informational subcategory of materialism, can give you conscious AI, because you say it's computational. Turing machines, AI is computational. If we get to a certain level of complexity, we might sort of get conscious AI. I interviewed Sir Roger Penrose, who of course has this beautiful point in The Emperor's New Mind, and sort of bring forward that consciousness must be something beyond algorithms, must be beyond computation. How strong is that argument still? I mean, is that
I've always liked the argument, but it is not necessarily a popular argument among physicists or computer scientists. In the Landscape of Consciousness website, we're adding a theory of the Blum family. It's Lenore, Manuel, and Avram, who's the son, Blum, and they're all MIT PhDs and computer scientists, all top faculty at Carnegie Mellon in the past. And they have their theory of conscious Turing machine, which is a very sophisticated approach to computational functionalism. And one can read it and assess it. But the point I'll make is, under their theory, AI consciousness is an absolute certainty at some point in the future. That's their point, and I totally agree with that, because it's completely consistent, and they have a very rich theory about that. So once again, it is your AI consciousness depending upon your theory of consciousness. If your theory of consciousness, where we are now in the quantum area, it is less certain than it would be under computational functionalism, like the Blum's theory, but it would still be possible, because what you would need to have is some kind of a manipulation, because in order to create something that is conscious, you have to manipulate the mechanism. And it's harder to manipulate the mechanism of quantum theories. Whether it's possible in principle, I'd be open-minded on that. I'd say it is possible, but it's not certain. Whereas in computational functionalism, it is certain and would happen at some point in the future. I think it would take a longer time than people think, that even if that were true. But under quantum theories, it's, to me, uncertain whether, if quantum theories and any of these different kinds of quantum theories are the true theory of consciousness, whether it's manipulatable enough, sufficient to create AI consciousness, is a further question. And I leave it that way. I'm not going to pretend to give an answer to something, but I do know that it's a different likelihood than under the computational functionalism.
Yeah, check. And we have sort of the Roger Penrose approach, sort of very much still trying to stay with the brain, and then you invoke quantum, because you say it cannot all be computational, so we need quantum effects, and then gives us consciousness. And on the other hand, we have Federico Fagin, who we've also featured on our channel, and very popular
very good
physicist now, saying that the consciousness can be equated with quantum fields. So that's a total different approach. You now say the quantum fields we know to be fundamental are consciousness themselves. Right. They express themselves in sort of brains.
Right. And that's sort of a panpsychism kind of way of thinking. We need to make one point that we've not made so far, and to me it's a very important one. And that is to discuss the concept of identity theory. So identity theory originally was a materialistic theory that said that brain states are the equivalent, mind states are the equivalent of brain states. And then it was ridiculed, they're so different and all of that. And we have all these different theories, that, the ones that you're mentioning, the 200 theories. One of my provocative points is that every theory is an identity theory. At some point in every theory, you're saying that is consciousness. Whether that is this, that, or that, or this, that, you're saying that's it.
Yeah.
A quantum field is it. Why is a quantum field a consciousness? It doesn't look like a consciousness. I don't see any red there. Why is it that rather than something else? But every theory makes that claim. That's why I like the work of David Papineau. Although I don't agree with his materialistic conclusion, I think he is the most precise in explaining identity theory to push everyone's nose in what they're saying. Because he says identity theory is absolutely the right idea. And that means that, the impulses in C fibers is the pain. That is it. And it is it in the hard sense and the radical sense of the morning star and the evening star, which you see in different places at different times, is the same thing. It's the planet Venus. It's just called two different things. Norma Jean Motensen, whatever her name was, became Marilyn Monroe. Those are two different names, two different people. But if you eliminate one, you by force have to eliminate the other. If you eliminate the evening star, there is no morning star. If you eliminate Norma Jean, there is no Marilyn Monroe. They are exactly the same thing. And David Papineau says that that's the principle for neurobiology. That's his view. I don't agree with the conclusion, but I think his view should be appreciated by everyone who studies consciousness studies, because every one of these theories is making that claim in some sense. Every one. And I can take every theory and show you how everyone is making a kind of identity theory claim. And if you ask me, I would say every one of them sounds ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense to say that that's what it is. And that is a deep fundamental issue. Maybe idealism comes the closest because you don't have to define it, because it is the fundamental thing and it's the full stop.
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of the classical God in the Abrahamic religions, where God is a necessity.
Yeah.
Whether it's a logical necessity, metaphysical necessity, these are two complicated questions. But that God is the absolute necessity, and therefore, if necessity is part of the essence of God's being, you don't ask the question. It's a meaningless question to ask, where did God come from, which is the obvious, come back to theism. But they eliminate that under the idea that existence and essence are the same thing, and the same thing would apply with pure consciousness, whether it's an idealism or non-dualism in India, and so that it's a full stop at that point. And that's fine, but you're still saying that whatever that is, whether it's a God or whether it's cosmic consciousness or any of these other theories, that is what consciousness is. And what I like to do is to make everyone, push their nose in this idea that you're making a claim that is what consciousness is, even though it doesn't look like consciousness.
I'm glad that you bring up sort of idealism that has this problem to a lesser degree, because I found it a bit hard to follow you here. Would it? But I do get sort of that you want to sort of make people sort of really say me where it is, and then stop sort of denying and say, okay, this is it, right? But for instance, if you really have this computational view on consciousness, then be concrete about it. We know what, software is hardware states. Okay, hardware. Okay, if I build a computer with tubes and valves, like a superplanetary water computer, I build a Turing machine. Yeah. We can build our LLMs. It'll be crazy. I don't know how much space it will take. We can build them with water tubes and valves. And if you claim an LLM to be conscious, then admit that superplanetary valve water computer is conscious. Is that sort of a way to understand this?
I think that's entirely valid. That's an entirely valid point. But I'm making a slightly further point. The point I'm making is that if you're saying that that's the consciousness, the tubes, the electron, whatever it is, you're saying that that's the thing that's conscious. And so if it's the tubes, why is it the tubes? If it's the quantum state, why is it the quantum state? If it's idealism, why is consciousness sort of the product of all reality? You're making some kind of claim. If it's a neural circuitry, if it's global workspace theory and recurrent things, why is it that? If it's electromagnetic waves, why of the whole brain, which are interesting theories, and making contributions, why is that the same thing as consciousness? Because that's what the claim are. It's not just that these are models and the reality is different than the model. It's that whatever the reality is, why is it that? And to me, for any of these claims, there are no answers that are available to my mental facilities. They're above my pay grade. Except, as I said, for a theistic view and for an idealism view, both set as definitional boundaries the nature of ultimate reality as non-penetrable. So the existence of God, where God's necessary existence is part of God's essence, and an idealism where consciousness is the ultimate non-reducible or non-penetrable existent. That's the existent.
Yeah.
That ends the conversation because you're defining it as such. And I think that's a legitimate point, even though we're still left with the ultimate question, which is my other non-consciousness lifelong question: why is there anything at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? But that's a whole other conversation.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. Fourth category, integrated information theory. I'm fascinated by it, and I've interviewed Christoph Koch. I've read about it, and so I know a little about IIT, but you might have a better understanding than I do if I ask you, what is IIT and what is its central claim? I mean, we just discussed that every theory is an identity theory. What is its claim about the identity of consciousness?
Yeah, I like IIT, and I revel in it in terms of its unique approach. It starts with an assumption of consciousness as a fundamental principle. It has a series of axioms and postulates, develops some mathematical theories. I like all of that. I particularly like, and of course, it talks about integrated information, what it would take, phi, and the nature of it, in order for information to be sufficiently integrated to create consciousness. As I said, I like all of that. What I particularly like is its approach to identity theory, because it has a quasi-spatial, structural, in some sense, world, although world is not a good idea, in which each conscious unified precept is, in a sense, a kind of structure in some kind of non-Euclidean, non-Hilbert space of some kind. And I like that because that at least recognizes that something has to be that conscious element, and they have that something. They don't talk about it too much because it sounds really odd to people who are, say, core neurophysiologists. It sounds like you're way out. It sounds, panpsychic. They're accused of being panpsychism. They say they're not panpsychists, and I respect that. Everybody who tells me they're not this, I'm not going to accuse them being of that. They say they're not. I'm going to take them at their word. And so Christoph Koch, Giulio Tononi say they're not panpsychists, and some people say they are, so I take them that they're not. But as I said, they have this structural idea, which I think addresses my concern that every theory is a theory of an identity theory, and they have consciousness being an identity with this structure that comes out of what's integrated information. So at the very least, I think IIT has made a significant contribution to our way of thinking. What has happened, as everyone who looks at consciousness at all knows, is they were accused by 124 philosophers and neuroscientists of being a pseudoscience because of a whole series of different things. We're not going to get into all of that. I think the incident is unfortunate in one sense and fortunate in another, which puts me on the outs with a lot of people, but it's fortunate in the sense that it focuses on the interesting things about IIT that maybe even they keep quiet, like this quasi-dimensional structure space that they have to have, which is part of them. I think that's a feature to be admired, not a a prediction that or an aspect that should be hidden and pretend that it doesn't exist, because I think that's a real feature of it, because it does then make a claim for what consciousness really is. I do personally criticize IIT, or criticize the way the scientific world has approached it, because in this so-called adversarial collaboration that treats predictions from IIT versus global workspace theory or others, each one makes a prediction and they see what happens. To my mind, the nature of the prediction does not really represent the essence of the theory, and it was forced because it had to be a scientific approach. It was forced to maybe it makes the predictions anyway, but it was forced to make that sort of the premier thing about the theory. To me, it's not. And so if the experimental work would have 100% proven the parietal cortex or the system that IIT predicted, if that was 100% proven, to me that would not then verify IIT. And conversely, if it were not proven, it wouldn't undermine it, because IIT to me has a different kind of approach that is not as susceptible to expressions of prediction that can be verified on an experimental basis. Now, Julio and Christoph might disagree with what I just said, that it is scientifically predictable from that point, but I'm skeptical of that.
Yeah, they will. I think they will admit to the fact that it is sort of, it might be in principle feasible, but I mean, practically speaking, to calculate phi, which is the measure of integral, is like incredibly complex, right?
Yeah, but I actually think that's a separate and good, a very important contribution, phi, because it can help you understand whether comatose patients are conscious.
Exactly,
and that's a real useful, extraordinarily helpful contribution to medicine and humanity. But I don't think it has a great ontological powers in itself. I don't think I think that phi has wonderful therapeutic analytical approaches and is a great contribution. I do not give it a lot of ontological power.
To just share my sort of take on IIT, my understanding of it, what I like, also you express what you like about it, is the fact that it says this is it. In a sense, the unfolded causal structures, like that difficult stuff that Christoph Koch, which I don't fully understand, but I do get the fact that you say it's not the computation, it's sort of the interconnectedness of the hardware, the interconnectedness of the system, which is its integrated information, and which we can calculate where it maximizes, and that gives us sort of a conscious unit, and that is it. And we can even say that at a certain moment, that unfolded causal structure maps one-on-one to conscious experience, for instance, of garlic, so it is, in a sense, if right, our first, or one of the first very accurate scientific theories of qualia, and that also, it surprised me in that sense that it got attacked with that letter that we should refer to. And I mean, you quote in your landscape article, you quote Alex Gomez-Marin, who you will be interviewing also, as a very interesting physicist and consciousness researcher, who said that IIT ticks too many non-materialist boxes. There is academic hate for non-physicalist speech. Cancel culture has unfortunately landed in the sciences and just now in neuroscience. And I mean, also David Chalmers said it sort of got nuked. So it's just this small dispute that got this letter. It's like, and I don't want to go too much into the politics of consciousness researchers fighting over stuff like this, but it does sort of raise my question. Hey, wait a minute. Here we have a sort of a theory that is scientific. I mean, it's scientific. It makes sort of accurate predictions if right. And now you start attacking it, and it seems like an ontological attack. So I can follow what the Marin is saying here. I was curious what your thoughts are, because you quote him. But where are you here?
Yeah, two of my favorite people or Dave Chalmers and Alex Gomez-Marin, work closely with them and long-term friends, and I respect what they say. My view is that IIT is a very important way of thinking that enlivens and enriches our whole study of consciousness. So full stop on that. I totally support that. I love it. I do not mind the pseudoscience attack, which sounds contradictory to what I just said. And the reason I don't is I like the adversarial spark, because it forces us to talk about it and to consider the deep essence of what the arguments are on both sides. And I have an orthogonal approach to it, where, as I've said, I think that IIT is a unique and very important contribution to ways of thinking about consciousness. It is for sure with Phi a medical and a therapeutic potential helpful intervention, which is of enormous ethical importance. What I don't see is the predictions that it claims to make as justifying the theory it espouses. So, because I think the nature of the requirements of proof in our society is so based on science that they are forced to do that. So if their predictions are wrong, as they put it, to me, it would not invalidate the fundamental aspects of IIT. It might invalidate some of the implications that led them to make that prediction, but it wouldn't undermine it. And conversely, if it happened, it wouldn't prove it correct, because as we talked earlier, that there's this significant disjunction I see when anything sort of touches something that is not expressible in the physical world. And IIT sort of is on the borderline there in terms of what it is. If there's anything about it that is not purely physical in the world, then the scientific method of prediction, experimentation, verification becomes loosened at the very least. And so that's why I love IIT as making a contribution, but I'm not looking for its either falsification or confirmation through scientific experiments.
Check. Yeah, and I can only echo what I know Bernardo Kastrup, sort of our director of foundation, says, and I like it. I mean, because it's like, for me, like just exciting, if true, that it could be sort of the first. He says it could be the first theory that bridges sort of the fundamental philosophical gap between the noumena and the phenomena, right? That it's sort of
that's great. Bernardo's great, and I think that's right. Of course, that's partially what gives rise to the criticism of the materialistic neuroscientists and philosophers to the theory. Yeah. So, I mean, that cuts both ways.
Yeah, check. Category number 5, panpsychisms. This is an interesting one, because I think panpsychism has been sort of growing enormously in the last decade or so, I'd say. But to me, if I want to really say something dummy about it, I'd say you're in search of a consciousness particle. I mean, when physicists, you see phenomena you can account for, in sometimes you have to sort of just invoke a new particle or field and you start looking for it. And now this feels to me sort of materialism, the hard problem, where we cannot find it. So it must be a fundamental property, say, of every particle. Is this sort of a way to understand panpsychism, or I'm not being too blunt here?
No, I think it's very simple. You said it well. It says that if you come to a full stop in materialistic explanations, purely physical explanations of the physical world, you have to assume that consciousness is an irreducible property. And if it's irreducible, well, it has to be somewhere. And panpsychism would have it at the fundamental level of a quantum field or a particle, and disputations about that happens. And micropsychism, where it's individual particles, or proto-panpsychism, if I get that right, where the particles or this field is not conscious itself, but you bring enough of them together and you have something like real consciousness or awareness. When you get at that level, I like to use the word awareness rather than consciousness. Consciousness is more associated with the phenomenal state of human or animal consciousness, where we have content and everything. But pure awareness can be devoid of content. And so if you have a very simplistic definition, might be, consciousness equals awareness plus some content. And that could be a definition of consciousness that I might have. So the pure awareness part would be what these quantum fields or whatever you have at the lowest level, but still giving rise to still giving recognition that the physical world has a reality to it. So it's not idealism where the physical world is derivative from, or in some cases an illusion of the material world, of the consciousness, fundamental consciousness. It's either an illusion or a derivative from it, but is has a reality to it. It's just that part of that reality is consciousness, as we say. Galen Strawson famously says that the real materialist is, has consciousness as part of the fundamental reality, and that's the real materialism. Because that's what the world is, and the world is material, the world is existent, and that's what it is. When I put on a different hat or look at it with a different squinty eye, if I were a Martian or something looking at all these human theories, it would be a little hard for me to discern the intense differences between panpsychism and idealism in certain sense. I mean, I can.
I'm happy you bring that up, because I was like, this is like dual aspect monism, or
right. All of these are artificial ways of taking different theories and trying to give some structural organization to how we understand them. But at its basic core, you're dealing with two different kinds of things. One where only the physical world is real, and that ultimately will explain consciousness without remainder. You need nothing else other than physical theories. You might have to expand your concept of the physical into quantum and other things. I mean, you can't go too far without getting into non-physical stuff, but you can make progress. And the other is non-physical. And when you're in non-physical aspects, whether it's dual aspect monism, whether it's panpsychism or idealism, they're all flavors of the same thing.
Yes, we are now at number 5, panpsychisms, already sort of 3 categories out of sort of the hardcore physicalist or the materialist theories that sort of can sort of rely, they're grounded in the scientific method, the third person perspective of the world. And now in these other categories, you have some problem, right? Because you try to sort of include that category of consciousness, which, if not material, how to study and how to make progress here.
So I like to distinguish between the scientific method, which is applied to all materialistic theories. The scientific method is one of observation or experimentation, repeatability, falsification, the repeatability by different techniques or different labs or different things, prediction and results. That's a scientific method. And I say that if it's a non-physical theory, or the theory has any aspect of non-physicalism to it, doesn't have to be all non-physical, any aspect, invalidates to some degree, invalidates the scientific method as I just described from being applicable. And I think there's a tendency in some theories that have some non-physical aspect to it to try to show their legitimacy by applying the scientific method. This also occurs a lot in the parapsychology things, which we can talk about in another category. And I think that's a false desire, because once you're non-physical, you are invalidating to one degree or another the scientific method. Maybe not totally, but in some degree.
But,
so what? So then, how do you make progress?
Yeah, that's
so
right,
I differentiate between the scientific method, which I've described, with what I call a scientific way of thinking, which is, another way to put it is a logical system of logical steps within generally an analytic philosophy framework, which also can be critiqued as not the only way of thinking in terms of a logical approach. So I would start with saying it's a scientific way of thinking. And a scientific way of thinking sounds like it is, if not experiment and replication, logical steps like analytical philosophy. But I make it broader than that. A scientific way of thinking means you are very clear about each step. So I can have a scientific way of thinking about faith and religion. I can have a scientific way of thinking, and I do. In other words, I can respect someone who goes through a process of understanding why God exists, and they've had some experience. And the scientific way of thinking, approaching that means at a certain step, they're making a leap of faith between certain steps. And so that's entirely proper if that's the way they think. I mean, and I judge that, but I want them to realize at that step, they're making that leap.
Yeah.
And that's a way of thinking. So you're very clear at each step why you are making that next step.
Yeah.
And that's what I would look for in any non-physical theory, is a rigorous step-by-step analysis to get to your conclusion. And even where you have to make a leap of faith or uncertain, you specify it and you know it. And oftentimes people don't do that.
Yeah, check. And preferably you make one leap of faith, right? So that's sort of, I know when interviewing Donald Hoffman say you have to grant every scientist one miracle. You need one miracle. Give me God and then I can explain everything. Yeah. But then further down the line, you don't want to make that, you don't want another leap of faith. Yeah. And a lot of theories suffer a bit here. That I think you're alluding to that, right? For instance, in thinking about panpsychism, okay, check. At the ground level, matter has sort of this consciousness quality to it. Now we do have a problem how to account, which is called the combination problem. How does that build up to me sitting here as a form of consciousness? And how can you say, because if that consciousness quality of particles is also right here, and what's the boundary between them? How do these different panpsychisms deal with the combination problem? And can they do so without sort of making leaps of faith?
No, I think every theory of consciousness makes a leap of faith. And the combination problem is the obvious one for a panpsychism. And it also might have to do with the boundary problem between different forms of us, because I'm sitting in a chair and made of the same material. So how am I differentiated my mentality from the physicality of my body or the chair? So you have a combination problem and a boundary problem. Idealism has its own issue. It's the dissociation problem. You have this giant big idealism worldview of consciousness. How then do you split apart different elements from it and make them isolated and non-overlapping? So each theory will have its own issues, and that's why we have a proliferation of theories. But as I said, each one makes a contribution to how we think and how we can appreciate the importance of consciousness.
And does panpsychism, because I agree, but wouldn't you sort of sub-specify that in a sense that if you approach that, for instance, under analytic idealism, it's not, empirically verifiable, but the mechanism of dissociation, for instance, that Bernardo Kastrup invokes, we do see in nature in human brains, people with schizophrenia. So you can we account for the mechanism. You invoke a mechanism that you do see in nature. I'm just curious if panpsychism has sort of a solution for the combination problem, that a mechanism, perhaps not yet, that they can test.
I think each of the elements of panpsychism has its own way of doing it. In cosmopsychism, you have sort of the entirety of existence being the primary form. So it has a great similarity to idealism, although there still are are differences. I'm skeptical that any of the theories, the combination of theories of panpsychism, ultimately works, that you can easily determine it. You can see how it could work, but you see how it has problems. Same thing with idealism. I'm familiar with Bernardo's dissociation theory with schizophrenia, and to me that's interesting, but to me they're operating at such radically different levels. It's not, shall we say, immediately persuasive.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That you could call, and you could label that a leap of faith in that sense.
Yeah. And a leap of faith. We're using that. I'm not using that in a pejorative way.
No, I get it.
I recognize those. There is a ultimate theory. I'm not a relativist. I'm not saying all these theories making a contribution. We'll never know that. There is a real theory. In fact, I've quipped at some point is that it's not that we have too many theories. It's that we have one too few.
That's interesting. It's like this Gödel incompleteness thing, right? Moving on, but there's this funny quote. I like how you quote David Chalmers, because he says such great stuff throughout the landscape. And around panpsychism, you have him saying, one starts as a materialist, then one becomes a dualist, and then a panpsychist, and one ends up as an idealist. Is panpsychism this in-between stop? Do you see it that way for people sort of under materialism towards, I wouldn't per se say idealism, it doesn't necessarily, but just let's say non-physical, on their journey towards non-physical, it's this your first subway stop out of materialism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a valid idea. It's a very clever approach. And it has to do with the strength of consciousness on the one hand, and your diminishing confidence in the nature of the material world, whether influenced by quantum physics or whatever else. I am less confident that I would move along that path, because I think that path has a constraint to it that's not recognized. It looks like it's the only way to go, but there are other ways to go. And if you have a theistic view of the world, then it's a radically different path. You'd utilize a lot of that same information, but you'd have an entirely different approach to that process.
Yeah. Check. We'll get to those more religious theories. Number 6, monisms. For people sort of new to the term, what is a monism?
Monism means there's only one reality. And that talking about a dualism, that there's a physical world and a mental world, or a mental world and a physical world and a spiritual world. The Abrahamic religions have kind of a dualistic approach. Indian religions sometimes have 3 different levels: a body, a soul, a spirit, and different esoteric philosophies and theosophy have different realms of existence. Monism says it's only one thing, and the one thing is the thing, and it is expressed, or is it seen, in different forms. And one form that you see is the physical world. Another form that you see is our mental states. But it's all emerging from the same thing. It's a little bit like, I don't know, an optical illusion, that there's one thing there, but you can see it in different ways depending on your mindset, or a hologram where it's only one thing, but you look at it and it has different forms or something.
Yeah.
Or a 4-dimensional object seen in 3 dimensions at different stages. I mean, there are different metaphors that we can use, but it's one thing, and that it has these different expressions. So Bertrand Russell famously started that, and then it's had different expressions along the way. And the concept of dual aspect has been utilized by a number of theorists, which to me are very interesting. Now, in doing the landscape, there are just certain people have said that they're monists, that they only believe in one thing. And therefore, it was hard for me to categorize them into something else because they say that they're one thing, and I don't want to necessarily. I'm trying not to disagree with what they're saying themselves about their theories, and so it's hard to. Some theories that are panpsychic theories are monistic theories, like Galen Strawson, who everybody says is a panpsychist. He says he's a materialist, the real materialism. He says that slightly tongue-in-cheek, but then he says, I'm a monist. And so I had to reference him in this panpsychism. Everybody calls him a panpsychist, but he himself says he's a monist. So I'm gonna respect his views and put him as a monist.
Yeah.
David Bentley Hart, who is an Orthodox Christian philosopher, theologian, and kind of a critic, says that his conception of God and the universe is a monistic theory. And so I put him also under monism because that's what he's saying his theory of God is a monistic theory of existence. And he has, his arguments for that. So monism is, I don't want to call it a catch-all theory because that sounds, like it's a slight disparaging. I don't mean it that way at all. I'm saying that there are a number of theorists who have theories that range from a panpsychist approach to a theistic approach that want to be classified as there is only one kind of existence, and because of that, I give that its pride of place by its own category.
Yeah, that's clear. That's that point you made, and I think it's a very valid approach because otherwise it would become very messy if you. I mean, you adjudicate, which you don't want to do, right? You categorize.
Right.
So but for people new to it, just for clarification, philosophically speaking and analytically speaking, physicalism is a monism.
Yes.
And idealism is a monism.
Yes.
So that can be a bit confusing, right?
Yes,
in reading this.
I totally agree with that.
And under monism,
where it how it is differentiated from the materialist monist and the idealist monist is that most of them claim some kind of a dual aspect. And that's the difference. So monism could have been called dual aspect monism because all of them have that characteristic.
Yeah.
And to have it just monism, it just fit better on a paper. It would sound like materialism and idealism could be in that. So everything could be a monism, or many things could be a monism. Yeah. But again, it's those who call themselves dual aspect monisms.
Yeah. Dualism, I find, next category, number 7, dualisms, I find very interesting. Because, of course, in Western thinking, the dualism introduced by René Descartes has been criticized and is not a favorable position. At least that's, I think, also how you describe it. But still, we see a lot of dualisms, many of which are come sort of out of the religious thinkers, and there you can understand it a bit better, right? Because they have sort of this conception of God and creation, which is sort of dualistic. So then you want to, but I'm just curious at other dualistic theories that are still sort of new as a position, because it surprised me in a sense as a category that it's still a position some people take, or is it a very much a minority position?
Among professional philosophers, it is certainly a minority position. I mean, there was one survey I think that was done that had it below 5% or 8% of philosophers. Philosophers, I think, would be more than 50% would be materialists, so you can judge the quality of their work based on your thinking about materialism. But dualism certainly is not favored among professional philosophers, and certainly most scientists are not dualists by any means. But the vast majority of the world are dualists. I mean, they think not that means anything. In terms of today's world. But, I take it much broader. I do not take it as originating with Descartes, although Descartes had a very specific expression of it. And the big problem with dualism, just like combination problem for panpsychism and the dissociation problem for idealism. Big problem for dualism is interactionalism. How does the non-physical world interact with the physical world? If the physical world is a closed physical system, and that has to do with free will. A lot of other things can be derived from that. But dualism it goes back, to Greek philosophy and Plato in one sense, certainly to the Abrahamic religions. If you have a God creating a physical world, which is a real physical world, it's not an illusory physical world. So the physical world created by God is a real world. It has its own ontological status. Whether that status has to be maintained by God on a sustaining basis, which many people agree with, or not, at least it has its own real ontological status and level. And so dualism is sort of a kind of your first folk religion that comes out of thinking, well, I'm rejecting materialism, and therefore there's something else other than move on to the panpsychism or idealism. But to me, dualism, is underappreciated in the scientific world, and I think just as panpsychism and idealism has its new adherents, I think dualism does as well. And there are different forms of dualism that have emerged. So an interesting one is emergent dualism, which makes the claim that the physical world is primary in essence, but once there's a certain combination of physical things, whether that's integrated information or whether it's some neuronal connections or whatever it is, that there are kind of overarching psychophysical laws that exist, eternally, that out of that physical structure, a non-physical thing would emerge. And that's called emergent dualism. Richard Swinburne, who is one of the leading philosophers of religion, has very strong arguments for substance dualism, which are not analytically dependent upon his theology. Now, it may be motivated by his theology and consistent with his theology, but it's not motivated by it. I mean, it is motivated by it, but it's not dependent upon it in a logical sense. He would say that he believes God created souls. That is part of the dualism. But, he says, and I find this very interesting, if he says I'm wrong about that, if God didn't create souls, it's entirely possible that souls can be an emergent quality of the physical world under some system. What he's sure about in his world, he is sure that there is a non-physical element in the human in order to create consciousness. He believes that God created it, each one, but he's not dependent. His argument doesn't depend on it because there could be an emergent dualism. Some claim that the interaction problem is not as severe and defeating as most people would think. And so even more recently, some physicists have shown that the physical world is not as closed as you think, and whether it's invoking quantum or chaos or various kinds of theories, they would show. I would think in a kind of a logical sense that if there is a God, and if there is a God who created everything in the physical world, and if that system is right, to me it's a leap of faith, but not a very large one, to think that there could be interactionalism in some case. So, I mean, we're all making leaps of faith in one way or another.
Yeah. And
what's important, I believe, is to understand for each of these where those leaps of faith are being made. But everyone is making a leap of faith of some kind. I mean, the materialists say they're not making a leap of faith, they're just going by science, but their leap of faith is that mental states can be described in terms of physical states. Yeah. So they start out with a leap of faith.
That's their departure point.
Yeah, but I am willing to take dualism seriously, as opposed to most people in the academic community.
There's what comes up with me in thinking back to quantum. I've always been fascinated by John Wheeler's work, the U, right, the participatory universe, and because that's, in a sense, you could say it's a dualist picture. It has the observer and the Big Bang, and it plays around with that, right, from his quantum perspective, observerhood and our physical universe. But it's connected. It's in that you, right? And then you have Amanda Gefter, a science journalist who I regard highly. Her. She's awesome.
She's great.
Trespassing on Einstein's Law. She written this beautiful her journey into very much of Wheeler's work, but she says sort of at that bottom you, where you have the observer and the universe, there's this overlap, and that's what puzzled Wheeler. And you have a student of Wheeler saying, because you could also say it's epistemic, it's about knowledge, it's the observer and his knowledge about the world, and what's ontic, right? It's what we regard to be ontic. And I think with Suzak, or you have like one of Wheeler's students who came up with like epiontic. It's like it's this connection between the two. And why I'm saying this is that for me, thinking about sort of these dualist pictures, when you have the two in the interaction problem, there is this moment where they do, if you want to interact, and right at that point, you're the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's epiontic, and then to me, you are monist again. So then I'd say it just feels like dual aspect monism would then be better to describe yourself, your position, if you're a dualist.
Yeah, look,
this is just something which fascinates me personally.
Yeah, and I think that's legitimate. Each of these positions can be defined in different ways, and how you look at the reality of the physical world and the potential non-physical reality, and how they interact. And you can define it in different ways. And each of the big categories I use is what people traditionally think, and then within those there are lots of variations. But the truth is, it's a smear. You could take this diagram, and if it's in ink, I just pour some water on it, it'll all smear together. And some of the categories are legitimately, properly smeared together. We'll leave materialism out.
Yeah, and the interesting though to read in dualism for people also what was new to me, sort of in Vedic and Indian thought, there were already debates sort of amongst dualists and idealists. And that's interesting.
Yeah, and the dualists were the weaker category, and not as surviving in Indian philosophy, but it definitely was an original category.
And what was also new to me is that sort of would you say that indigenous thought sort of...
what I wanted to do, and this is a little story I really would like to tell, is as I was doing this paper, it came about, by the way, not because I had this great motivation to suddenly write the landscape of consciousness for everyone to talk about, but I was asked by a scientific journal. One of the editors are on the board, John Torday, who has a theory, to write an short introductory article to their special issue on quantum consciousness. And he wanted me to give an overview because he watched Closer to Truth and thought I would do that. And I resisted for 3-4 months because I obviously so much work I was already doing. I knew this would take extra work, and I would have to do it right, and I wouldn't do it, and I can't do it, so I'm not going to do it. And then he asked me a few more times, and then suddenly I realized that if I'm ever going to do that, I really do want to do something like this. If I'm ever going to do it, I better do it now, or I'll never do it. And this is an opportunity, and it will be published. I don't have to worry where it'll be published, in a review article. And I'll say, okay, I'll take it now. When I agreed to do it, I knew it would be a lot of work. But honestly, this is not an exaggeration. The amount of work it was less that I thought it would take, which frightened me, was less than 5% of what it took. I mean, it was like 20 times more than even the worst fear I had. So it's lucky I didn't know what was to come, or I wouldn't have started, but just each step as it occurred. And early on in that process, I realized what I wanted to do was to encompass all human thought as much as I could. And that required not only the sophisticated philosophical arguments like Bernardo's Analytical Idealism, which was absolutely essential. It was one of my first theories I put in because it was so important, dualistic theories, but dualistic theories that were more theological from the major each of the major traditions, mainly Christianity and Islam, Judaism to a lesser degree, because it's less involved with metaphysical questions, at least more recently. And then I realized indigenous religions have their own take on it. And so in order to, not that I believe in animism or these various things.
No, but I think it's very important.
But I wanted to encompass all human thinking. So we have African religions, we have Chinese religions, folk religions that are part of it. And these are not done patronizingly. They are done honestly as an expression of the diversity of thinking. And so my first draft that was submitted for peer review, was like 50,000 words compared to 175. I didn't know what was coming, but it was 50. And it had a heavier skew towards the religion and the philosophical. And the peer reviewer, who I don't know, still anonymous, was excellent, recommended some theories I had not included, which was very helpful, but said that, look, this is the Journal of Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology, and our readers are not going to be interested in the philosophical theories of, the idealism, panpsychism, and certainly not the theological theories. And so, but you've done a great job with the scientific theories, and so that's great. We'd definitely publish. But if you take those out, it'd probably be better. And I wrote back. I wrote a long thing, thanked him for all his help. And I wrote back and I said, look, if I were you, if I were in your place, I would reject this paper because of what you said. And I would put it stronger than what you said. I would say, if you don't take it out, we're not going to publish it. That's what I would say. But you were kind enough to say, I suggest you take it out. I literally said, you're right. And if I were you, I would say, take it out or we're not publishing it. And I said, but here's my position. I'm going to do this once in my life. And I'm now at the position where I'm going to do this. And I'm going to do it where I feel comfortable and self-fulfilled, even if nobody ever reads it, that I've produced what I think is my best expression for the nature of consciousness as expressed by the totality of human thinking. And that's what I want to do. And that's what I'm going to do. And if you publish it, I will be thrilled. If you don't, I will be disappointed, but understand completely, and I'll look for another way to publish it, even if I have to self-publish it in some way. And to their credit, they agreed and let me publish without anything cut.
It's awesome, I think, and it's also beautiful as a life's work that you had to include it all. And I do think making the move from dualisms to idealisms, it does seem to me that sort of let's wait for the closing door. These sort of religious thought that you brought in is now becoming, in my opinion, is becoming more valuable again because it now goes hand in hand with sort of like analytic idealism. It sort of resonates with some of the quantum theories, right? So it's very interesting to see how ancient thought and these ancient ways of thinking about consciousness now are sort of synthesized in a sense, I'd say, almost. And I was, of course, happy. I mean, we were clear about our position at the Essentia, but to just quote you here, if anything, idealism's explanatory stars seems on the ascent, shining brighter as consciousness maintains its mysteries and idealism attracts more adherents. And I just, I was like, you're being like, okay, this is awesome too. But I mean, a bit more serious.
I'm not making a value judgment there. I'm making an observation.
Yeah, you put it poetically.
Yeah,
which is very
I'm
nice.
making an observation. I'm not saying I'm happy about it or sad about it. I'm saying that's real, and I take it seriously, and I think it's fascinating. What I do object to, and I get this a lot. I get people, scientists, writing to me and showing how quantum science and cosmology and modern science is in the Vedic scriptures, is in the Quran, is in the Hebrew Bible. I haven't heard too many people saying it's in the New Testament, but in each of those things, and they show it's there. I don't accept that. I don't think that's correct. I think there are analogies. I think there are common ways of human thinking about consciousness, so that both what the Vedas saw, the Vedic scholars saw, and what the perhaps the Quranic interpreters saw were similar kinds of senses of the universe. But I do not ascribe scientific revelatory truths in the ancient religious traditions.
I get that, but on the why of you say you just make an observation here. What sort of you think the reason for the fact that it is gaining popularity? Is that sort of because
I think it's so exciting to see it, both an idealism and panpsychism, and even a little bit dualism, which I've kind of, in my own way, slightly favored over time, because it's a recognition that with the proliferation of materialist theories, it's just not working. Perhaps my favorite quote is from Jerry Fodor, who was a great philosopher, psychologist of mine, and he said, "It's not that we don't know what it's like to have a theory of consciousness based on the physical world. It's that we don't know what it's like to even know what it's like to have a theory of consciousness based on the physical world. So it's a second order. We have no idea." And that position has gotten more and more recognized, that each of these materialistic theories just don't cut it. And the more you see, the more you feel that. And therefore, people are some enthusiastically, but many reluctantly, moving towards non-physical theories in which there are the different expressions. And idealism is sort of the ultimate level of where you go, and so you can't go beyond that. So that's the ultimate stopping point for the nature of consciousness. But what I will say about idealism that I've been struck by is the number of different expressions of idealism, of how it's described. I mean, there are, I would say almost hundreds. Now, I've chosen a few because some of them, are both everybody thinks they're original, but they're very repetitive of each other, and also internally consistent. Bernardo's analytical idealism is, shall we say, the most modern, thoughtful expression of it, because of the analytic approach. His work as a computer scientist has given him that capacity to do it. So, I personally would relate to that way of thinking, perhaps more than other kinds of idealism. But each of them has a sort of a twist to how consciousness is the ultimate reality, a self-aware universe, or consciousness is all there is, or the fundamental ground of being, and then how then the physical world comes out of it. Is it an illusion, or is it derivative, or is it a manifestation? So there are variances on how it occurs, and to me those are very interesting. Each of those brings a new vista, a new way to think about idealism. So when we say idealism, just like when we said quantum, we know what we mean by that, but it's important, and what I try to do is show all the different expressions of it and how they differ, because that can enrich our understanding of what that means.
Yep. And when people say, interesting, this is a bit going outside your landscape, but it does relate to sort of scientific method versus the scientific way of thinking, which of course our foundation is very much about scientific way of thinking, but because it's about metaphysics and philosophy, we cannot per definition apply the scientific method there. A lot of our viewers, and I think people who are a fan of, for instance, Federico Faggin's theory, love it for the fact that how they read it or see it as sort of, now science and spirituality are finally getting together. Now sort of sort of Buddhism is now proven, right? And so there's this deep wish to bridge the gap, so to speak, and I get it. But I also feel that we have to be humble there and say, yeah, it's compatible with some of these spiritual traditions. But if you truly want me to say anything about karma or reincarnation or your chakras and all that stuff that might be compatible with analytic idealism, we do have to be quite honest there. It's a leap, often multiple leaps of faith.
Yeah.
How do you just, I'm just bringing this up because I'm just curious to converse with you about this.
I totally agree with that. And that goes in both directions. It goes from, analytical idealism to people who would justify Buddhism, or Buddhism would go in the other direction. So it is we like to try to do that, to bring spirituality and science together. A lot of people will do that. I try to be, very rigorously approaching each in its own world and not trying to make artificial bridging, because then I am making my own multiple leaps of faith to satisfy my own kinds of interests.
Yep.
And I try, very vigorously not to do that. And resist when people do that. Each has its own right to be understood in its own context, and that's that's fine. There is certainly a tendency with Buddhist thought to relate a lot of this to Buddhist thought, and I think Buddhist thought has its own very interesting approach to the nature of nothing or emptiness, which is not really an emptiness. It's an emptiness of intrinsic value, of permanence, of kinds of thing. And I think that's very interesting. And it is perhaps complementary with an E. I mean, it with theories of consciousness, but it is not synonymous, and it is not a proof of it, or consciousness doesn't give that additional credence. Both are the expressions, the broad expressions of human thought about the nature of reality, and that I love.
Yeah, and you, as I, want to be careful there. You want to be rigorous. To just share sort of how that works for me is that I wouldn't say it's schizophrenic, but I make sort of this cut somehow that I do my work for Essentia Foundation, and I'm sitting down with you and talking about this and try to be scientific and rigorous. And then I also might watch some woo YouTube video on.
Oh, we all like to do that.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's not that it's just that let's say it like this. I love the fact that through analytic thinking and I can sort of not prove it, but at least say it's compatible. I don't have to deny that sort of lived experience that I also do have. And that relates back to what you shared earlier, the fact that you had difficulty in sort of science or materialist science denying the human being that thinks about eternity and that's in search of meaning. And that's quite bluntly sort of denied in materialism. How does this work for you personally? Because you've said very often here that you take this step back. You only spend like 2 lines on your personal position, which I really want to go into that.
Yeah, so I can describe the process of the landscape paper, which really addresses this question. I went through literally 7 or 8 stages of resubmitting after peer review. And so I give Elsevier and the journal Product Biophysical Molecular Biology credit for putting up with my really monomaniacal changes and because as it went. And about the 6th time when it went through a third peer review process, because I made so many changes they had to do peer review again. Other peer reviews were superficial. I mean, they said fine. But when they did, they had a rule. This was in December of 2023 when I had sent in a version, that they have a rule that within 3 days they publish it online, even if it's not going to be published in the journal for 8 months or so. And it was published online, but I never knew that. And so suddenly it was online, and I hadn't finished it yet.
Scary moment.
And I really panicked.
Yeah.
Because the first thing people was going to have at that point was like 120,000 words. So, I mean, eventually it was much longer, and I was in the process. And I panicked, and I said, because somebody wrote to me and said, I saw the paper, and it was interesting, and here's what you left out. And I panicked. And I said, you got to take it down. That was a mistake. They said, that's our policy, because we promise people as soon as it's peer-reviewed and it's published. And I said, it's not finished. It's peer down. I said, we can't do that. And I said, go to your higher authorities, whoever I have to talk to. This must be taken down. So it took about 2 weeks, and they told me that, look, the only time we have ever taken down a paper is when we've discovered plagiarism or fraud. And people are going to think we take it down, you plagiarized or fraud. I said, I don't care. I don't care what they think. Take it down. So they please, and so they finally took it down. They put a notice. They said, we expect to publish the paper again. If we don't, we'll explain why. So people might have assumed there was some fraud about it. Now, and so I was happy they took it down. Upset that it was put online. Now, what I didn't realize is when it was first put online, even in incomplete form, that keywords triggered a lot of people finding it and reading it. And I got 20 or 30 emails, of which, maybe a dozen were really substantive. Some of them were angry at me for leaving out a theory. And one of them was a theory that I rejected because it didn't make my level of confidence. In politics, they call it an Overton window, which means the window in which a politician is willing to make outrageous statements. And above that, too outrageous, they won't do. So wherever your Overton window is, you can make certain outrageous statements as a politician, but not above that. So my Overton window was at a level where I rejected the theory of theosophy and Rudolf Steiner in terms of their vision of the soul. I could barely follow all the different categorizations of how the soul migrates or whatever. And I got at least 2, maybe 3 letters, extremely angry. These are from Rudolf Steiner associations. And they were sophisticated people and saying, I really blew it by missing it. So, and other people wrote in other theories I'd missed. So there were probably about 15 or 20 of the 200 theories that came to me, not through me at all, but through people writing into this mistake when the paper was first accidentally published ahead of time. And then I spent a lot of time on those theories. I spent 2-3 days on Rudolf Steiner. I never expected to do that and put him in as I did theosophy. Now, one of the other criticisms I had from this early publishing was that we couldn't find your theory, what you believe in there. And I wrote back and I said, you couldn't find it because I didn't put it. And I didn't put it because 2 reasons. One, it really doesn't matter what I think. It really doesn't. And I don't take what I believe particularly seriously, so it doesn't matter. And secondly, if I put it in there, everybody's going to assume that I'm skewing all the other theories to subtly support what I believe, because I'm, undermining this one or presenting, and that's really not the case. I'm really trying to present every theory as the theorist would present it himself, but doing it in a way which I try to make it even more believable than the theorists themselves would do it, because they're too close to it. I'm making it as believable as possible. And if I put my theory in there, it'll undermine my objective. And then a couple wrote back and say, yeah, if you do that and you leave it out, people are going to think you have a hidden agenda, because everybody has a theory. So now they're going to think you're not only directing it, but you're doing it surreptitiously. So I was caught between a rock and a hard place. I didn't know what to do. So I decided how to solve the problem was I put in what I think, and I used, 39 words in the text and 33 words in a footnote. So 72 words altogether out of 175,000. And the distinction, and all the other theories are between, minimum of 400 words to maximum of 1,500 words. And mine was, 39 words plus a footnote. And that was deliberate to make the point. And so I said, look, if you're forcing me to reveal it, and for what little it's worth, here's what I think. 39 words and 33. And what I said was, what I still feel is some sort of a dualistic idealism mashup. And then I put a footnote and I said, if that's wrong, my next would be something that relates to the quantum world, which surprised me because I was always very negative on quantum theories. But having read all these and worked through all these, I now would have a feeling. And if even that's wrong, I would counterintuitively, and you're going to think I'm nuts, devolve into an eliminativist, illusionist approach. So that's my three levels. And, I'm not going to defend it. I'm just going to state it because I don't want you to think I'm hiding anything, but it doesn't influence what I'm saying. So that was what I said. And that is true. And it actually goes back to the first thing we talked about, which was that initial emotional insight. I mean, everybody has a sort of a foundational idea that's imprinted on us or something. And I have to admit that was what it was for me. Can a being who can conceive of eternity be denied it? Is the nature of all reality such that it produced a being who can conceive of eternity and yet be denied it? Is that what reality has created? And I felt and still feel that that's not the case, that there's something about reality that has, I don't want to use the word deliberately, but that is consistent with having beings who can conceive eternity and somehow participate in it.
Yeah.
And that's just an emotional, lifelong feeling that then expresses itself in sort of a dualism, idealism framework. And how I mash the two together is I would be and again, I have very low confidence in my own opinion, so don't take this too seriously. I would be a dualist, but in the sense that the non-physical part of the dualism has a primacy to it. And so I could just as easily maybe say I'm an idealist who gives real credence to the generation of a physical world. Physical world is not an illusion, which is some idealisms would have it being an illusion. It's not an illusion, and it may be caused by, but it's not derivative, and the physical world does have a real ontological status, which is, but as a pure dualist, you would have to say something like both have a permanent ideological status, and I would feel that the non-physical aspects of dualism has even in a timeless sense, has an explanatory pre-existence in some sense. It's not a time sense necessarily, but an explanatory prior, that the non-physical aspect of a dualism has a non-physical explanatory prior, and if it's an explanatory prior, that would lead to some kind of an idealism. So that's why I blend these two together. But I don't ask you to believe it, and I can't really go further to explain it.
Thank you very much. I think that's beautiful. That sort of backstory, and also sort of the paper coming out too early has sort of contributed to its richness.
Yeah.
And as you said, indeed, you quoted yourself correctly. It was very interesting to read sort of your own position so briefly described. And as you say, also I can describe it, dare not defend it, right? But I do think I interviewing you say you would be part of your own landscape, which you yourself could not do. But I'm interviewing you here right now. I think you described it very, very eloquently, this position. And so it would be that it has a sort of, it's an idealism with an objective. You want to sort of keep an objective reality, right? You don't want to end up in a solipsist world where it's all ideal, it's all mind, and you could say all an illusion, because there does seem to be something which is so permanent, which is not mind, right? That's just very intuitively. But you do acknowledge the fact, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to sort of grasp your position and sort of converse with you about it. And how
it's a little bit like Jell-O, you know. You grab it; it's kind of hard to grab, but
yeah. But it's like so you do believe that it's permanent, but you also acknowledge the fact that the observation of that objective world goes through mind. It goes through these phenomenal states. It goes through qualia that you have to perceive it. So I get you fully there, that it just feels natural to say, okay, that must be primary, but still I cannot deny that there's something so permanent and which is not mind. So that then is a form of dualism. Yeah, or dual aspect monism. What's in the words here, Robert?
Look, I am always a little bit of a contrarian, so I don't mind using the word dualism. I don't mind that. Other people would have a dual aspect monism, and these words have soft boundaries between them. And you can easily describe one in terms of the other, and that's easy to do. But I like saying dualism because it makes it clear, and it's not just that that mind is able to perceive a physical world. But it is the real ontological status of the physical world on a mind-independent basis that I would believe. But I would not. But if I have the physical world and some kind of non-physical existence, both with strong ontological status, I would tend to think that in an explanatorily sense, that the non-physical is primary in some way. That's why I would not be, pure dualist, but be more of an idealist or even a theist dualist. That there's something explanatorily prior to the dualistic world. So I'd say the world today is dualistic, I would say, to be simple. But in a generative sense of how that happened, that the non-physical aspect has priority.
I think there's this book by, is it Paulo Coelho, or what's his name, the Kabbalist, or I forgot. Anyway, it's this story about sort of being close to a treasure and this lifelong search. I'm just sketching the essence of the book. It's a beautiful book. I'll put it below in the descriptions once I have the title. Good. And then he at the end of his life, or sort of at a long journey, finds the treasure to notice that he was sitting just on it. And why I'm saying it, and it's sort of, I find it a bit emotional, even because I just feel connection with you sitting here, Robert, is that, I mean, in preparation, I also went a bit into your earlier work, and you wrote this article back in '69, right? The Human Mind, and you said it has to be this non-physical component in it. And now you have this lifelong journey, because it's more than 50 years ago, right? Yeah. And you hear me explaining this eloquently. Feels like this beautiful circling around it, and having found better words for it. But in a sense, it feels like the same essence still, right? But I find that beautiful, and I wouldn't say that sort of...
I appreciate that. Other people would say you haven't made much progress in your life.
I guess that's a critique you hear, right? It's also a critique I read sometimes with people watching Closer to Truth.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. And I refuse to bend to an artificial certainty. Yeah. I'm going to say what I believe in. What I believe may be wrong, but I'm not going to pander to desires, either my own or others, to come to conclusions I don't believe in. But it is true that the first article I did in 1969, which was written, a year or two earlier, so I was 23 or 24 at the time. And that expressed the same view, that should a being who can conceive of eternity be denied it. And that was sort of a foundational idea to begin to look at the human mind. And what I did at the time is comparing the human mind with the mind and activities of non-human animals. And you see such a vast difference between them, between the outputs. Now, we can explain a lot of that in terms of culture and various other things. But I speculated at the time, if there's something non-physical, that non-physical element could be different for different types of beings. That the non-physical, it doesn't have to be exactly the same kind of thing. And so if you're willing to admit a non-physical element into your creation of consciousness, then there could be differences between the ones that humans have and other animals have. So that was part of that way of thinking. I've really not pursued that part, but the overarching feeling about the nature of reality based on human perceptions is very real. And so I disagree with some people in the last category, which we haven't talked about, the challenge category, who say that the human mind is incapable of understanding consciousness. And that's the answer. A lot of those people would be from even a materialistic point of view. So materialism doesn't work because we're not smart enough to do it. Our brains evolved for avoiding jaguars or, sustaining ourselves through glacial winters, not to understand the nature of reality. So we're not going to be able to do it. I reject that idea. I don't think that's the case. I think we can perceive, just like we can quantum theory and the structure of the universe. I think we can make progress on consciousness, especially if it's materialistic. If it's not materialistic, then we have a different way of thinking, but we can then isolate it. So, I am not a skeptic in terms of our capacity to understand. But I try to be very rigorous in being sure that the steps we make, we have clarity in the logic that we're using and when we make the leaps of faith.
Category 9 is, of course, a very important one to end with, which is sort of anomalous and altered states, right? Here we have Dean Radin. So he's done extensive research on just what we empirically can say about sort of the psi phenomena, stuff we just can't physically explain, and near-death experiences, telepathy, what have you not, telekinesis, there are all these phenomena. And he himself says, which I like, because if you are scientific about it, there's so much to debunk. There's a lot of woo out there, but he says, yes, 95% of these reports may have mundane explanations we can debunk, but 5% do not, and that 5% changes everything. Talking about that 5%, and what is your take on sort of how serious we should take sort of these findings? And
I am very committed to really deeply understand anomalous phenomena. And also altered states, because there are many people who I respect who use those activities or experiences to inform and even direct their theories of consciousness. So we must do that. Independently, I had an early, very strong interest in parapsychology. So when I had this first feeling that the brain was the thing that I wanted to study, almost at the same time, I began to look at the parapsychology literature and found this fascinating, because this also was potentially a shortcut. And, we always look for shortcuts to understand things. So rather than going through all the elaborate things of studying quantum physics and physics through, 8 years of graduate school, parapsychology is a shortcut. I can get right there by seeing a difference, in reality, where reality can supersede physical law. And in fact, as a teenager, I wrote to one of the founders of the field, J.B. Rhine, at Duke. And when I was in my first year in college, and skipped a couple of grades and did some things, I communicated with him, and he invited me to do my PhD in parapsychology with him at Duke. And I almost did that, but decided that, in the real world, it might be better to do a hard science in neurophysiology. So that was the choice that I made. But I took it very, very seriously, and I followed the field in the 60s and 70s, and then I wouldn't say lost interest. It didn't seem to make progress, and I really didn't follow it much until starting Closer to Truth. And in Closer to Truth, we have parapsychology, psi, ESP, as a small part, not a big part of what we do in consciousness, but we have the approach that I'm not going to adjudicate this. I'm not going to look at the evidence and claim this and claim that, because it's a minefield of radically different opinions, but rather ask if these phenomena are true, and if the 5%, I would have it less than 5%, but it doesn't matter. If there's one that violates, that's real, it's real. I mean, it's like being pregnant, it's you're either pregnant or not. So if one is real and violates the laws of physics with precognition, knowing the future, or clairvoyance, sensing at a distance that you have no sensory input, if one of those is real, then it really changes everything. So Dean is 100% right about that. I would make the comment on the very first Closer to Truth series in 1999, Dean was on it. And Dean made a wonderful statement that I've retained for my entire life. And he said, in parapsychology, he said, if the best psi expert or experiencer were to come with me to Las Vegas, we would still lose all our money, but we would lose it slower than other people.
That's awesome, yeah.
Now that's a wonderful comment, and it really leads to some deep thinking about the nature of the scientific method as opposed to as applied to parapsychology and psi research, because it is an example of what I've said earlier, which is a foundational feeling of distinguishing the worlds of physical and non-physical, where the scientific method works in the physical world, but a scientific method does not work in the non-physical world, or it may not work, and what works is a scientific way of thinking. And so, to my mind, to enforce the scientific world of replicability and experimental, in psi experiments, is not something that I pay a lot of attention to, because I think there is a potential fundamental logical flaw, like a category error, in applying the scientific method to something where the science. Now, if telepathy and if clairvoyance, if that is an expression of something having to do with the physical world, of quantum theory and non-locality in some physical determination, then the scientific method, as it applies to quantum theory, can work. But if it's beyond that, if the psychophysical laws of reality, or if the panpsychist or idealist or theistic world exists, and that's part of it in some sense, the scientific method is not going to work, or it's going to work intermittently. And so, therefore, what Dean said about the uncertainty of the capacity, to me, speaks very deeply about the nature of reality. Because I think, and again, I don't want to consider myself an expert on psi phenomena, but the degree that I have looked at it, I believe there is something there, but I do not think that that's demonstrable by the pure scientific method, even though many people, including Dean, think it is. I would not go that far. And so that sounds like it's I'm spouting a contradiction, that I'm saying I believe that it's real, it's not subject to scientific method. But why that's consistent is because of my feeling the difference between the scientific method and the scientific way of thinking. Yeah. And therefore, but if it exists, it really does inform your theories of consciousness, because it would invalidate many, if not all, the materialistic theories. And that's why it's important.
Yeah, and if you're then committed to add to this, right, I can follow. But if you're committed to the scientific method, you should be committed to falsifiability. So you're in search of black sheep, you're not the next white sheep.
Yeah.
And then what Dean says makes perfect sense. If you can encounter a phenomenon that's just sort of a black sheep to a materialist worldview, you should, if you're committed to the method, look for it, right? And that's what I love, for instance, about Alex Gomez-Morin, who you will be interviewing on Closer to Truth, which I find great, who does research, for instance, on extraocular vision. So it's crazy phenomenon that people they can just see without eyes. So it's crazy. And he says it's crazy. Why are you studying this? Yes, but because it just basically says because I'm scientific. I just want to, and I don't want my theory to stand in between nature or my observation of nature and myself. And I do think that our theories you can put your theory between yourself and the world in a sense. And I think that's just a mistake. And I'm not saying that only materialist people do this. You can do this across the board in the landscape. But don't you think that's sort of, for me, very important?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we should be as not neutral is the wrong word, because I don't want to. I'm not neutral. I'm passionately focused, but not obstructed by my own presuppositions. That's why I put my own theories on a very low level of confidence level, because I really want to explore. And so, I've looked at quantum theories and I've been, more amenable to it because of that. And in parapsychology, it's not just psi experiments. It's out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. I mean, people are very passionate about these things, and I take them seriously as data points, but not in a scientific sense. And so, if there's anything about this stuff that's true, about any of his anomalous phenomena, it doesn't exist in the same physical, and I use that in an epistemological sense, world. It does not. It exists in some other kind of there's something else going on. Charlie Tart, who's one of the founders of parapsychology, has a theory, and again, with all theories, I'm almost sure it's wrong, but it's a very interesting theory. And his theory is that parapsychology, or what's happening in parapsychology, is not some anomalous phenomena. It's the normal way that the mind and the brain work together. And because the mind and the brain work on this psi relationship. And once in a while, it sort of leaks out, and somebody else can catch it. And therefore, it's non-reproducible in a scientific way, because it's all going on within the individual person. It's the normal way it works, and occasionally there's a leakage. But the leakage is not the normal thing. And so that's a crazy theory, but it has some elegance to it. It has a coherence to it. And so my belief is, and why I've included it, and why I included it, and again, the original peer reviewer didn't think it was relevant, because it wouldn't be looked upon seriously by hardcore scientists. But I said, I'm sorry, this is part of the way I see the world. This is a necessary way of thinking. I'm not saying it's real, but I'm saying if it's real, it does inform our theories of consciousness, and you can't get out of it. And so that's where I leave it. I am not adjudicating whether it's completely false, which some people do, which I do not do. I do in fact believe that some of it is real, and it does violate physical law, which would immediately invalidate materialistic theories. I believe that, but I also believe it's not susceptible to the scientific method. Because of something, because of something, and that it's and it is remotely. And if it is real, which I think it is, that it's just some quirky thing that is going on, or some non-normal thing. I mean, even with near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, if these were real, veridical approaches to reality, and when people die, that this is what happens, there'd be a zillion more cases of them. It'd be much more frequent, and it's not. And it's a lot of anecdotal examples, but it would be much more frequent. I also want to include the two sort of quasi-scientific approaches in terms of meditation and psychedelics, because I include that in this category. And my simple approach to it: these are very interesting, very perceptive and insightful ways of understanding humanity and our human way of thinking. But neither gives me any veridical confidence that I have that is giving me a shortcut to ultimate reality.
I did find you a bit harsh on psychedelics, I must say. That sort of your But that came also from me interviewing Christoph Koch, who's now sort of has had some personal
I
experiences.
know, I understand that.
Yeah.
I get a lot of advice to take psychedelics.
Yeah.
And my answer is, I really do. I mean, I could show you a box of emails about saying I'll get a lot closer to truth if I take psychedelics. And my answer is, if I did and I had this great vision stuff, I wouldn't trust it. I mean, and I don't see it. I don't mean to demean it, but I mean, if somebody hits you in the eye, you see stars. It's a similar kind of biological intervention in your serotonin or acetylcholine uptake or whatever that's distorting things for a while. And is that the insight to see ultimate reality? I'd be shocked. Honestly, if reality was such that psychedelics was the way to see ultimate reality, that would be a shock to me.
It is exactly what Christoph Koch said. He was like shocked. Yeah. Okay. Let's leave it at that when it comes to psychedelics. This has been a wonderful conversation, Robert. I've enjoyed it very much, and I thought on an ending note, I'd love to end. We already discussed your personal positions. I don't know if you want to go there, but before that, before I ask you like a very personal question, more on your landscape, the work you've done. Stuart Kaufman says on the landscape, by publishing the landscape, you shall have changed it. And you, of course, cannot tell me now how this will change. That would be just like speculation. How do you hope to change the landscape of consciousness?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Stu's a very innovative thinker and a good friend. By the way, his theory, which I've included, is a very interesting one because he differentiates between potentia and actual in terms of possibilities and actualities. And he involves quantum theory or quantum observation as converting the possibilities to actuality. So once again, it's not something that I would agree with, but I think it makes an important contribution. It's a new way of thinking. So he is very good. And he was, very generous with his comments. I didn't have any motivation to do that. My only motivation was that if I don't do this, I'm going to really feel bad. And, it's a very mundane and prosaic kind of life kind of thing. But I have been pleased where it's now been cited dozens and dozens of times in less than a year and in the scientific literature, and anybody who's dealing with consciousness does refer to it and saying here's the totality of the landscape, and I do think it helps people recognize that it's not just a battle between integrated information theory and global workspace theory. That's not the battle for consciousness. That it's a bigger landscape. And I think this is a time of importance. I would like to add one thing that is of a social nature, which is not part of Closer to Truth or landscape of any way, but it has affected me and it surprised me. And that is beginning, I guess, during COVID. The viewership on Closer to Truth on YouTube really took off, and because everybody was isolated and quarantined. And what I began to recognize was that we were getting comments from all over the world, and particularly from religions and races and countries that were in conflict with each other. And so from India and Pakistan, from, Turkey and Syria, and from Russia and Ukraine, and from Myanmar and Bangladesh, and people from each of these cultures writing in. And none of them talked about politics or anything. They only talked about the nature of consciousness or quantum physics or something that we're dealing with on Closer to Truth. And I recognized that the questions we deal with on Closer to Truth, particularly, a big one is consciousness, which is the landscape as well, are these universal questions which cut across religions, races, gender, socioeconomic level, even educational level, and therefore potentially are a great unifier of humanity around these questions. I mean, we've had hundreds of people from the Hindu tradition and the Muslim tradition writing in to appreciate closer to truth, even though in the early stages we didn't deal very much with their particular views. Recently, in the last 3-4 years, we have. But even before then, they were very appreciative. They said, look, take a look at our culture too. There's a contribution. But they really appreciated that we are dealing honestly and seriously with these big questions. And so that I recognize is an additional contribution that we make, and essentially you make too, because what we're doing is we're dealing with universal questions that cut across all superficial differences between peoples.
Yeah.
And to me, I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, I could not agree more, and it's just beautiful to hear this from you. Our founder, Fred Matser, who founded the philanthropist who founded our foundation, in Dutch he says, het bewust te zijn, the conscious being, and the philosophy of non-dualism, dualism, how it contributes to sort of more harmonious living together on this planet, which is at the heart of Essentia, and our mission achieves that through analytic idealism. But at the heart is just harmonious, more harmonious living together.
Yeah, and our approach is a little bit less specific, but says that just to ask these questions is a great unifier of humanity. Yeah. And together we can all expose it. I have to tell you maybe one final story, which is always one of my favorite. It was some years ago, and it was a woman writing from Bakersfield, not the highest in California, not the highest intellectual country. And she said, I'm whatever it was, 58 years old, 65, and she said, man, she was probably 65, and she says, I have a husband and 4 sons. And so I have 5 men in my family. And they all think I'm nuts because I've been asking these questions about the universe or existence or what we are. You know, one son is a mechanic, another son runs a farm equipment machine, another's a truck driver. You know, these are great people. I love them, but none of them understand me. And I really felt that I was an oddball. And then in the last year, my 13-year-old grandson has been asking these questions. And he and I together watch Closer to Truth.
Awesome.
And to me, that was, you know, she maybe graduated high school with him, but there's something in some people who have this passion for these big ideas. And here it was the grandmother and the grandson. Everybody in the middle thinks they're both crazy, but they both unified and came together to watch Closer to Truth. So that's so cool. That's beautiful. That's good.
Just one final thought I thought funny. I want to share with you just funny on your landscape, and then I'll move to my final question. In preparing, I didn't open with it because I thought it's a bit sort of not that funny, but I once saw this sort of documentary on bird watching in the UK. And it was like about sort of, have you really seen a bird or not? Like, and sort of controversy arising out of that amongst the bird watchers. You claims you make, you could not have seen that special bird. I'm not a bird watcher. So there was this one guy who took on himself the role to police sort of the whole community of bird watchers, to just note what they said and check it with each other, you know. And he said, that's such a funny moment in the documentary. I'll see if I can watch it out and put it in the description. He says, it's a nasty job, but someone's got to do it. And Robert, you've done the nasty job of mapping
very
them all.
Very apropos.
Yeah, right. So just thanks for that. I think it's wonderful and it's important. And final question. We've talked a lot about Closer to Truth. The moment you die, do you suspect that you will then get as really closer to truth?
I think that's almost a tautology, because at that moment you will know or not know what is the next step. So I think that for sure the answer is yes to that. There can be variations on it. There could be, you know, some Eastern religions have a period of time where you're a hungry ghost, I think, in Buddhism. So you're sort of quasi thing, and then you go into a different state and have a reincarnation. In elements of the Abrahamic religions, you have a sort of a disembodied state, and then plan for a resurrection. And in some aspects of the Abrahamic religions, you're completely dead. You have no consciousness whatsoever, but will be resurrected. So, it's never over.
But what do you hope personally? What do you believe personally?
Well, I very different from what I hope and what I believe. I mean, that's you can't equate the two. So I can easily describe what I hope and what I'd like. That doesn't mean reality has to listen to my desires. But I'll start with what I hope is not true. Obviously, I hope it's not true that materialism right, and that's the end. And as I've argued without logic, I think that's illogical. I think that it would be a strange reality that gave us the capacity to imagine eternity and be denied it. So I've said that several times, and I emotionally believe that. I would also, so I don't want to have non-existence. Some people would, and I understand that. I don't. But I also don't want to have the become a drop in the ocean of consciousness. I don't want to merge back into the ocean of consciousness from which I came. That would not be a nirvana to me. I want to maintain my individuality. And so, many forms of Eastern religion, it's sort of a contradiction. You have the reincarnation aspect of multiple lives, but the ultimate is to kind of eliminate all of that and to be sort of merged back into this ultimate reality. And I've always asked, if that's the ultimate, that's where you came from, why did you have to go through that whole process to get back to where you were? But it's a separate issue. Even in categories of idealism, where you lose your personality, I mean, that does not appeal to me. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's not what I want. I'm fiercely interested in maintaining my personal identity, and maybe whether reality is consistent with that, I'll have to find out.
I'm very much looking forward to watching sort of the Closer Than Truth on the other side, your show continuing on the other side. Robert, thanks so much for this wonderful interview.
Good,
Thank you for your time. And it's wonderful.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for watching this rather lengthy discussion. I think it was worth it, every minute of it. We will put all links down in the description below, a link to the landscape of consciousness and the theories we've referenced to. And if you have any questions, let us know. We can follow up.
And also the Landscape of Consciousness website.
Good that you mentioned it.
Which by the time you have the show, I think will be launched in beta site. There may be bugs, but it'll be an expansion of the Landscape of Consciousness paper. And it'll be quite significant, very easy to navigate and find the theories. And
great.
Yeah,
so maybe if we can already show a little bit of it in our edit, or you're a bit cautious?
Sure. Cool. It's still, we're supposed to get what's called the minimum viable version in a few days. So we'll have that. It won't be finished. It won't be ready for beta site. Beta site will be during the summer sometime.
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Thanks for watching.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Great.
Merci.